What's up, guys? Welcome to Supreme Harry. We've got something special today. What if Harry opened the Slytherin-Ravenclaw vault at age 10 and found the 9 rings of the First Lords? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive in. Chapter 1, The Vault Beneath the World. The cupboard under the stairs at number 4, Privet Drive was exactly 32 inches wide. Harry knew this because he'd measured it once with a piece of string he'd found in Dudley's room, the same afternoon Dudley had punched him in the stomach for touching the string. He'd measured it anyway, afterward, lying on his thin mattress listening to his cousin thunder up the stairs above him, and the number, 32, had felt important in some way he couldn't explain. Like knowing the exact size of a cage made it slightly less powerful over you. He was 10 years old and he'd already learned a dozen quiet ways to survive. Don't look directly at Uncle Vernon when he's drinking. Don't let Aunt Petunia catch you reading anything that isn't a school textbook. Don't finish the food on your plate too fast because it suggests you were hungry, and being hungry was, for reasons Harry had never fully deciphered, something shameful in this house. Don't dream too loudly. Don't exist too loudly. Exist precisely as much as necessary and no more. He was good at it. Better than anyone knew. What no one at number 4 had ever noticed, because noticing things about Harry required caring about Harry, which none of them did, was that Harry had been having the same dream for 3 months. Not a nightmare. Not exactly. In the dream he was standing in a forest he didn't recognize, trees so old they'd stopped bothering to grow upward and instead spread wide, their roots erupting from the soil like sleeping animals. The forest had no sound. No wind. And somewhere beneath his feet, something was waiting. He always woke up before he found it. Until the night of the 14th of July, when he didn't. It started the way the dream always started, the forest, the silence, the feeling of something underground pulling at him like a tide. But this time when he followed the pull and knelt at the base of the oldest tree, the roots moved. Not violently, not with any drama. They simply shifted aside, the way a door opens when you've finally found the right key, and beneath them was a set of stone stairs descending into dark. He went down. In the way of dreams, the darkness wasn't frightening. It was more like stepping into a room where someone had just left, the air still warm, the presence still there. At the bottom of the stairs was a chamber, its walls carved with symbols that Harry somehow understood without being able to read, the way you understand that a fire is hot before you've ever touched one. And in the center of the chamber, on a plinth of dark stone, were 9 rings. He stood looking at them for a long moment. They were nothing spectacular to look at, plain bands of different metals, some dark, some bright, 2 that seemed to shift color the longer he looked at them. No jewels. No engravings he could make out. Just rings, sitting in a loose arrangement on the stone as though someone had set them down on their way out and never come back. He reached out and picked up the nearest one. The chamber exploded with light, and Harry woke up in his cupboard at 3 in the morning, heart hammering, and on his right hand, on 3 of his fingers, were rings. He sat up so fast he knocked his head on the low shelf above him. He held his hand up in the dark and stared. They were real. Solid. He could feel their weight, slightly cool against his skin, and when he pressed his thumb against one of them it didn't flex or move the way cheap jewelry would. He felt, very distantly, like standing at the edge of something enormous, not a cliff, more like the shore of an ocean he'd had no idea existed. He went back to sleep. By morning there were 9. He didn't tell anyone, which in retrospect required no particular decision since there was no one to tell. He wore long sleeves through the rest of July, not because he was hiding the rings, they were visible, he simply didn't care if people saw them, but because summer in the Dursley house meant garden work, and long sleeves meant fewer scratches from the rosebushes Aunt Petunia was perpetually at war with. The rings, for their part, did absolutely nothing for the first week. Then things started happening. Small things, at first. He was washing dishes and he noticed the water in the sink moving in a slow circular pattern when he wasn't touching it, and when he looked at it directly it stopped. He was pulling weeds in the garden and he reached for a particularly stubborn one and the soil around it simply loosened, as though someone had already dug it out for him. He was walking past the television when Dudley was watching some loud violent cartoon and he thought, distantly, "That's too loud," and the volume dropped 6 bars. He stood very still in the hallway, looking at the back of Dudley's head. Dudley picked up the remote and turned it back up, confused. Harry went back to the garden. That evening he sat in his cupboard and looked at the 9 rings. He touched each one in turn, trying to feel some difference between them. Some were warmer than others. One of them, he'd started thinking of it as the dark gray one, though its color genuinely seemed to shift, made his pulse slow when he touched it, a deep, settling feeling like the moment you stopped holding your breath. Another one made the air near his hand smell briefly like rain, then something burning, then nothing. "Right," he said quietly to no one, and went to sleep. He started practicing. He didn't call it that because he didn't have a framework for any of this yet, but what he was doing was practicing, small, deliberate tests in the corners of the house or garden where no one would see. Moving water. Getting a candle to light without matches. He'd found a half-melted candle in the bin and kept it in his cupboard, and in the evenings he'd hold it and concentrate and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the wick would catch. The things he could do were inconsistent and strange and made absolutely no logical sense. He found he didn't mind this. Logic, in his experience, had mostly been used as a weapon by people who wanted to prove he was wrong about things he knew were true. What interested him more was the feeling that accompanied the rings, not just the physical sensations, but something deeper, like a kind of knowing. He'd be walking past Uncle Vernon's study and get a sudden, acute sense that Vernon was in a foul mood before he could possibly have heard anything to indicate it. He'd be at school and find himself predicting, accurately, which of Dudley's friends was going to be the one to start trouble. He stopped getting caught in petty cruelties he never would have seen coming before. He moved through his days in the Dursley house like someone who had finally learned to read the weather. It was, he thought, the closest thing to peace he'd ever felt there. By the time August ended and September began, Harry had established a few things with reasonable confidence. First, the rings were magic. He'd arrived at this conclusion by the simple method of ruling out everything else and accepting what remained. Second, the magic was old. He didn't know how he knew this, but he knew it the way you know when a piece of furniture in someone's house is genuinely antique. There was a quality to it, a weight of accumulated time that newer things didn't have. Third, they were teaching him. Not in the way a teacher teaches, with explanations and instructions and tests. More the way water teaches a stone, gradually, through sustained contact, reshaping something that had seemed fixed. He was reading more. He'd always read when he could get books without the Dursleys noticing, borrowing from the school library and returning them before anyone could comment, but now he was reading differently, with a kind of hunger that was almost uncomfortable, like his mind had gotten significantly larger and was aware of its own empty spaces. He read history and mythology and anything with the word ancient in the title, and while none of it gave him precise answers, it gave him the sense that he was building a map of a very large territory he'd only glimpsed the edges of. He was thinking about that map when the letter arrived. He heard the owls before he was fully awake, a racket from the kitchen that was too insistent to be the neighbors and too persistent to be ignored. By the time he was out of his cupboard, Uncle Vernon was already thundering downstairs in a dressing gown, face the color of a bad sunset, and Aunt Petunia was standing in the kitchen doorway looking at something in her hand like it had personally threatened her. Harry looked at the envelope on the kitchen table. His name was on it. His name and the cupboard under the stairs. Something about that last detail, the precise, unarguable specificity of it, the fact that whoever wrote this knew exactly where he slept, made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Not with fear. With recognition. Vernon snatched the letter before Harry could reach it. That was, as it turned out, a tactical error on Vernon's part, because the letter was the first of approximately 43 letters that arrived in the following week, each one more creative in its method of delivery than the last. Harry watched this escalating situation with something approaching amusement. He didn't try to read any of the letters. He didn't need to. The rings had been quietly filling in certain gaps in his knowledge, and he had the distinct sense that when the right moment came, he'd understand everything. The right moment arrived in the shape of a very large man with a very large fist who knocked the door of a sea-facing shack off its hinges on Harry's birthday. Hagrid sat down heavily enough to make the whole structure flex, handed Harry a slightly squashed birthday cake, "Happily Birthday Harry" written in green icing, and said, "Right. Expect Yevi got questions." "A few," said Harry. He let Hagrid tell him about Hogwarts, about magic, about his parents. He listened carefully and completely, which was its own kind of discipline. The rings had done something interesting to his perception of when people were telling the whole truth versus the version of the truth they decided was appropriate, and Hagrid was clearly a man who believed entirely in what he was saying even when he was leaving things out. The gaps were gentle ones, protective ones. Harry didn't push. When Hagrid mentioned you-know-who, his massive hands went careful and still, and Harry said, "Voldemort," very clearly. Hagrid flinched like he'd been poked with something sharp. "That's his name, isn't it?" Harry said. "I don't see much point in not saying it." Hagrid stared at him. "You're a strange kid, Harry," he said finally, but he said it like it was a compliment. "I've heard that." Diagon Alley arrived like a fever dream. Harry stepped through the leaky cauldron's back entrance into the alley and stood for a moment letting the whole thing wash over him, the noise, the color, the sheer density of a world that had been here all along, parallel to everything he'd known, and no one had thought to mention it. He felt something move through him at the sight of it, warm and complicated and difficult to name. Not quite anger. Not quite grief. Something that lived between them, the feeling of finding out you've been lied to not by malice but by careful omission, and that the thing you were kept from was beautiful. He moved through Diagon Alley with his hands in his pockets and his eyes taking in everything. He noticed, because noticing things had become essentially automatic for him, that people looked at him. Specifically at his forehead, with a quality of recognition that was either reverent or hungry depending on the person. He kept his hair down over his scar and moved steadily, and when a woman grabbed her companion's arm and whispered "It's him, it's the Potter boy," he didn't slow down. He just adjusted his direction slightly and went around the long way. Gringotts was extraordinary. He didn't say so, because Hagrid was already being demonstrative enough for both of them, but the deep underground magic of the bank was something Harry could feel in the rings, a resonance, like two instruments recognizing the same key. The goblins looked at him with the same flat intensity they probably gave everyone, but one of them, an older goblin with deeply scarred hands, looked at his rings and went very still for exactly half a second before his face closed back into professional blankness. Harry held the goblin's gaze for a moment. The goblin looked away first. His vault was far richer than he'd expected, though he registered this with more curiosity than excitement. He took what he needed. As they were leaving, he glanced down the cart tracks that extended further into the mountain and thought about the vault in his dream, the stone plinth, the rings, the carved symbols. He thought about it and then let the thought go. He had a lot of shopping to do. The wand was the part he'd been thinking about most. He'd read enough, dreamed enough, felt enough through the rings to understand that a wand was not simply a tool. It was a relationship. A conversation between two things that had to want each other. He'd been thinking about what kind of conversation he wanted to have. Ollivander's was quiet and strange and smelled of cedar and something older. The old wand maker himself appeared from between shelves like someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment, which, Harry supposed, he probably had. "Mr. Potter," said Ollivander, and there was something reverent in it that Harry didn't especially want, so he moved past it. "I've read about wand theory," Harry said. The core and the wood both carry resonance. The wood affects the nature of the connection, flexibility, focus, warmth. The core affects the kind of magic it amplifies. Is that accurate? Ollivander blinked. That is, broadly accurate, yes. What are your most unusual cores? The wand maker looked at him for a long, considering moment. Then he smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had waited a long time for an interesting customer. He pulled a tape measure seemingly from nowhere, and while it measured Harry's arm span on its own, Harry looked at the shelves of boxes and thought about what he could feel. There was a box near the back, dusty enough to suggest it hadn't been moved in a long time. He could feel it the way he'd learned to feel things through the rings, a low, complex vibration, like something wound very tight. He didn't point at it. He waited. Ollivander gave him 7 wands in succession. None of them wanted him. One actually singed the end of a shelf when he waved it, and Ollivander caught the box before it could fall with the reflexes of someone who'd dealt with this before. With each failed attempt the wand maker looked more interested, which Harry found more amusing than concerning. "Curious," said Ollivander, and he went to the back shelf. The box he brought back was the dusty one. "I've had this for a very long time," Ollivander said, lifting the lid. Inside was a wand of dark, almost black wood, slim and slightly longer than average, with a quality to the grain that made it seem like it had been carved with something that moved. "Holly and phoenix feather would be the conventional match for you, Mr. Potter. But I suspect you are not a conventional case. Blackthorn and thestral tail hair. 11 3/4 inches. This wand has been waiting. I genuinely believed it was waiting for someone else entirely." Harry picked it up. The response was not the shower of sparks he'd seen with other wands. It was quieter than that. A deep warmth moved from his hand to his shoulder to the back of his skull, and all 9 rings resonated simultaneously, a chord of sensation so complete it was almost sound. He could feel the wand and the rings recognizing each other like old acquaintances, and he stood there for a moment just holding it. "Yes," said Ollivander very quietly. He was looking at Harry's hands. At the rings. His expression had gone through several rapid and complicated changes and arrived somewhere that was not quite fear but was in the same neighborhood. "Mr. Potter, those rings, thank you," said Harry, setting the coins on the counter. "For the wand." He walked out into the alley while Ollivander was still deciding what to say next. He spent the rest of the shopping day efficiently. Robes, fitted by a woman who kept trying to steer him toward the standard cuts and didn't quite understand why he kept steering back. Books, he bought everything on the first-year list and then stood at the bookshop looking at the history section until he'd added 6 more. A cauldron. A telescope. An owl at the magical creature's shop, a snowy white one who looked at him with gold eyes and held out her foot for his hand like they were being formally introduced. "What do you want to be called?" he asked her. She clicked her beak. "Sable," he tried. She ruffled her feathers in what seemed like approval. Hagrid had gone quiet somewhere around the bookshop. He kept giving Harry these sidelong looks, the kind you give something that isn't quite what you expected and you're still working out if that's good or not. Harry didn't push it. He liked Hagrid, liked the straightforwardness of him, the genuine warmth under all that scale. He was a person who wore exactly who he was on the outside, and Harry had spent enough time around people who didn't to find this deeply refreshing. Over lunch at the Leaky Cauldron, Hagrid finally said, "Where'd ye get the rings, Harry?" Harry looked at him over his pumpkin juice. "Found them." "Where?" "In a dream." He said it simply, without drama, the way you'd say at the market or in the street. Hagrid stared at him. "Rings ye found in a dream," he repeated. "And then they were real when I woke up." Harry tilted his hand slightly, letting the light catch the bands. 9 of them. They've been teaching me things." Hagrid's mouth opened. Closed. He looked like a man who had been prepared for a relatively standard conversation and had arrived somewhere significantly more complicated. "Harry," he said carefully, "there are people who'll want to know about those." "I know." Harry set down his cup. "That's why I'm telling you and not them." Hagrid looked at him for a long time. "Yet trust me?" There was something almost surprised about it. "You came and found me," Harry said simply. "You brought me a cake." The big man's eyes went slightly wet at the corners, and he looked away, scratching the back of his neck. "Right," he said gruffly. "Right. Well. Don't go showing them to just anyone, Harry." That's all I'm saying. I don't intend to, said Harry. September 1st arrived grey and damp, as London in September usually is, and Harry stood on the platform at King's Cross between platforms 9 and 10 and looked at the barrier and thought, of course. This was entirely in keeping with what he'd learned about the magical world, that it was everywhere the non-magical world was, just slightly to the left of where you were looking. He walked through the barrier without hesitation and into the noise of platform 9 3/4. The train was red and massive and beautiful in the way that things built for a single specific purpose are always beautiful. Steam billowed across the platform and through it moved families, parents loading trunks, children hanging out of windows, owls protesting in their cages, an orange cat of extraordinary girth yowling at something near the third carriage. Harry loaded his trunk, got Sable settled, and found an empty compartment near the middle of the train. He was sitting with his new copy of The Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts open in his lap and not quite reading it. He was watching the platform, watching the families saying goodbye, when the compartment door slid back and a boy with a round face and an anxious expression leaned in and said, "Sorry, is it all right if my name's Neville, Neville Longbottom, all the other compartments are, come in," said Harry. "I'm Harry." Neville came in with the energy of someone who expected to be told no. He sat down across from Harry and clutched a small wooden box on his lap and said, "Is that an owl?" "She's beautiful." Sable, from her cage, regarded Neville with the kind of calm evaluation she applied to everything. Then she made a soft sound that was distinctly approving. "She likes you," said Harry, and Neville looked so pleased by this that Harry closed his book. "Is your family magical?" Neville nodded, and something complicated crossed his face. "My gran is. My parents were, they were Aurors." He paused. "They got hurt. By Death Eaters. They're in St. Mungo's." Harry held Neville's gaze and didn't look away from it or soften his expression into the performative sympathy people usually deployed for bad news. He just said, "I'm sorry," and meant it completely. Neville looked slightly startled, the way people sometimes did when they got exactly what they needed and weren't prepared for it. "Yeah," he said quietly. "What's in the box?" Neville brightened considerably. "A toad. He's called Trevor. I keep losing him." He opened the box slightly and a small, very unimpressed toad regarded the world from within. "My gran says he's not a dignified pet but she got him for me anyway." "Trevor's a good name for a toad," said Harry. They talked for a long time. About families, carefully, both of them with enough absence in those stories that they'd learned to navigate around the gaps. About what they were most curious about at Hogwarts, Harry said ancient runes without having to think about it, Neville said herbology with a confidence he clearly wasn't used to feeling about his own opinions. They ate sweets from the trolley. Harry bought enough for both of them, quietly, before Neville could look embarrassed about not having much, and when the door opened again toward early afternoon, 2 more people appeared. One was a girl with bushy dark hair who was already in her robes and carrying an enormous book in one hand and a calm, slightly superior expression on her face. The other was a boy with pale blonde hair and 2 larger boys flanking him like furniture. "Has anyone seen a toad?" the girl said, then looked around and noticed Harry. "Oh, I'm Hermione Granger. I've been helping people find lost things on the train, it's been rather chaotic." "Neville's toad is here," said Harry. "I'm Harry." She opened her mouth, glanced at his forehead where his hair had shifted slightly, and then, and Harry noticed this specifically, filed it away with appreciation, she did not say "Oh, the Harry Potter." She said, "Are you first years?" "I've read all the course books already, have you?" "I'm particularly looking forward to Transfiguration, though Charms seems fascinating too." "Ancient runes," said Harry. "Though it's not a first-year subject." Her eyes lit up. "No, but there are introductory texts, I have 3. "Do you want to?" "Yes," said Harry. They were immediately in conversation that the blonde boy's entrance completely failed to interrupt. He'd pushed the door wider and was looking at Harry with the particular expression of someone delivering a prepared speech. "I heard Harry Potter was on the train," he said. "I thought we might. I'm a bit busy," Harry said pleasantly, without looking up from the rune diagram Hermione was pointing at. There was a pause. "I'm Draco Malfoy." "Okay," said Harry. Another pause, longer. Draco Malfoy had clearly not prepared for okay. "My family is very well connected in wizarding society. Your father's name is Lucius Malfoy," Harry said, still without looking up. "He was a suspected Death Eater who claimed to have been under the Imperius curse. He donated very substantially to the Ministry the same year those charges were dropped." He looked up now, meeting Draco's eyes. "I've been doing a lot of reading. You might want to think about whether name-dropping is the impression you want to make." The silence in the compartment had a quality to it. Neville had gone very still. Hermione looked between Harry and Draco with the expression of someone watching a chess game where one player has just made an unexpected move. The two large boys behind Draco shifted their weight. Draco's face had gone through several colors and arrived at white. He started. "You could just come in and sit down," Harry said. "Or you could leave. Those are the real options." For a moment, just a moment, something moved behind Draco Malfoy's grey eyes. Not anger. Something more uncertain, something that hadn't been prepared for the encounter and wasn't sure what to do with itself. Then he stepped back and let the door slide closed. Hermione let out a long breath. "He's going to make your life difficult," she said. "Probably," Harry agreed. "Here, look at this one." He turned the page back to the symbol she'd been explaining. The castle appeared out of the dark like a promise. Harry stood in one of the boats beside Neville and looked up at Hogwarts as they crossed the lake, and for the first time in the entire day something moved in him that was beyond curiosity or analysis. The castle sat above them against a sky full of stars, lit from within, every tower and turret reflecting off the black water, and the feeling that moved through him and through the rings, simultaneously, like a current passing through connected things, was something he had no word for. Not quite coming home. He'd never had a home. But something adjacent to it. The feeling of a door opening in a direction you hadn't known doors could open. The rings were warm on his fingers. All 9 of them. Inside the castle, Professor McGonagall, sharp-faced, precise, radiating the specific energy of someone who had done this many times and still took it seriously, explained the sorting. Harry listened and watched and noticed the other first years, most of whom were anxiously trying to remember what they'd read about the houses. He was looking at the doors beyond which the older students presumably waited, and he was feeling the ring's sense of this place, the way they recognized the deep magic in the walls and hummed with it. The ghosts appeared and caused the predictable stir. Harry watched them with frank interest. McGonagall led them in. The great hall was extraordinary, the bewitched ceiling reflecting a stormy night sky, for long tables, hundreds of faces turning toward the line of first years. Harry walked in and didn't look at any of them in particular. He looked at the high table, moving from face to face, reading what the rings offered him. A tall, thin woman with a severe expression and hooded eyes near the center. He felt from her the particular flavor of guarded intelligence, of someone holding things very close to their chest. Severus Snape, he guessed, though the name arrived slightly ahead of the recognition, a gift from the ring's accumulated knowledge. At the center of the table, Dumbledore. Ancient, genuinely, the rings responded to his presence the way they responded to very old magic, all white beard and twinkling eyes that were, Harry noted, much sharper than the twinkle suggested. They found Harry in the crowd. Harry met them steadily. He had questions for Albus Dumbledore. He was content to wait. The Sorting Hat sang its song, and Harry noted with interest that the song was doing something structurally unusual. The final verse was different from the versions in the history books, more urgent, the language slightly darker at the edges. No one else seemed to notice. Names were called. Hermione got Gryffindor and looked briefly surprised and then not surprised at all. Neville got Gryffindor and looked like he might fall over with relief. Draco Malfoy got Slytherin immediately, the hat barely touched his head, and walked to the green and silver table with the expression of someone completing an expected formality. "Potter, Harry." The whispers started before he'd taken 3 steps toward the stool. He sat down and placed the hat on his head and it slid down over his eyes. "Well," said the hat's voice in his ear, and there was something very different about its tone, something that sounded less like a school tradition and more like a very old thing encountering something it hadn't encountered before. "I've sorted thousands of students, and I have never, those rings, boy. Do you know what those are?" "I'm working on it," Harry said. "The First Lord's own tokens. All 9. Worn by one student." The hat seemed to be doing something analogous to clearing its throat. "This is unprecedented. Where should I go?" "Where do you want to go?" Harry thought about this. He thought about what he'd read about each house, not the mythology of them but the actual histories, the kind of people who'd built them and the kind of people they'd produced. He thought about what he wanted to build and what he wanted to become and what kind of people he wanted to become it with. "Gryffindor," he said. "Yes," said the hat, with the tone of something confirmed. "I thought so. Though I'll tell you this for free, Potter, you could have taken any of them. All 4. That's the truth. There hasn't been a student since the founders themselves who, Gryffindor," the hat announced to the hall. The Gryffindor table erupted. Harry took the hat off, handed it back to McGonagall, and walked to the table. He sat down next to Neville, who was grinning, and across from Hermione, who gave him a look that was pleased and assessing in equal measure. "The hat took a while," she said. "We were having a conversation," Harry said. "About what?" He considered telling her. He decided, not quite yet. He glanced up at the high table, where Dumbledore was watching him with a mild, interested expression that Harry was already quite certain was not mild at all. He looked back at his plate. The first-year feast materialized in front of them, and Harry loaded his plate and listened to the hall, the hundreds of voices, the owls, the flickering candles, the castle itself settling around him like something that had been waiting, and on his fingers the 9 rings were warm, and all of them were his. He was 10 years old for 4 more days. In a year he'd be back here. For now, he ate his dinner and watched everything and said nothing he didn't mean, and when Percy Weasley leaned over to welcome him to Gryffindor and mentioned that he was the house prefect, Harry said thank you and meant that too. Across the hall, Draco Malfoy was watching him. Harry caught his eye once, briefly, and then went back to his conversation with Neville about whether treacle tart was objectively better than every other dessert. It was, and if Malfoy spent the rest of the feast trying to work out what kind of person said okay to a Malfoy, that was, Harry thought, probably a productive use of his time. Dumbledore stood and began his beginning-of-term speech. Harry listened to every word and stored it carefully. Outside, the Scottish sky was dark and wide. In the lake, something moved. In the walls of Hogwarts, the ancient magic breathed. On Harry Potter's fingers, 9 rings from the dawn of the world caught the candlelight and held it, each one a different color, like the chord before a symphony. Harry was ready. Chapter 2, The boy who arrived. The dormitory in Gryffindor Tower had 5 beds, red curtains, a window that looked out over the grounds toward the Forbidden Forest, and 4 other boys who were all, in their various ways, trying to figure out how to exist in the same space as each other. Harry lay on his back in the dark an hour after lights out and listened to them. Ron Weasley, in the bed to his left, had fallen asleep almost instantly with the ease of someone used to sharing space with 6 siblings and had no anxiety about it. Neville, to Harry's right, was still awake. Harry could tell by the quality of his breathing, the small adjustments in his mattress. Seamus Finnegan had talked himself to sleep halfway through a story about his ma'am attempting a spell she'd seen in a magazine. Dean Thomas had said almost nothing all evening but had taped a football poster to the inside of his curtains with the focused efficiency of someone establishing territory. Harry wasn't tired. He was thinking. The rings were warm in a way that was different from their usual low heat, something about the castle, about being fully inside it now rather than approaching it across a lake. Like the difference between standing at the edge of a fire and sitting beside it. He held his right hand up and looked at the rings in the thin blue dark, the faint moonlight from the window catching each band in turn. He thought about what the Sorting Hat had said. The First Lord's own tokens. He'd been building a picture of who the First Lords were from everything he'd read and everything the rings had fed him, and the picture was large and incomplete in ways that interested him. They predated Hogwarts by something close to a millennium. They'd built the earliest foundations of organized magical practice in Britain, not just spells but systems, philosophies of magic, the deep grammar of how one thing connected to another. The 9 of them had each approached magic from a different direction, and together they'd covered something close to the whole of it. He thought about Dumbledore watching him at dinner. He thought about what that watching had felt like, thorough, careful, the way you watched something you'd been expecting and were now reassessing in light of how it had actually arrived. He was not afraid of Dumbledore. He wanted to be clear with himself about that. There was a difference between respect and fear, and what he felt toward the old man was a careful, arm's-length respect, the kind you gave a chess player who was already several moves ahead, while you worked out whether you were playing the same game or different ones. He pulled the curtains closed and went to sleep. Morning in the castle was a different creature from morning at Privet Drive. At Privet Drive, morning meant moving as quietly as possible, making no noise, getting out of everyone's way before they could decide his existence was inconvenient. Here, morning was Seamus burning his toast with a wand he wasn't yet entirely in control of, and Ron Weasley appearing from his curtains with his hair in a state of architectural improbability, and Neville discovering Trevor the Toad under Dean's bed, and the general cheerful chaos of 5 people who had decided, with the unconscious efficiency of first-years who'd survived their first night, that they were probably going to be all right. Harry dressed quickly, helped Neville corner Trevor, and went down to breakfast. The Great Hall in the morning had a completely different energy, the ceiling was clear blue, the light was sharp and clean, and without the ceremony of the evening before, people moved and talked and ate with the relaxed purpose of a place that was genuinely lived in. He loaded his plate and found the space beside Hermione, who was already there with her timetable and a cup of tea and an expression of structured enthusiasm. "Double Transfiguration first," she said, by way of greeting. "Then History of Magic, which by all accounts is very dry, then Charms. I've made notes on what we'll likely cover based on the course description and the first-year texts." "What color are your notes?" Harry asked, reaching for the pumpkin juice. She paused. "Blue for main points. Green for references. Red for things I need to follow up. Can I see them?" The question visibly surprised her, in a good way. She pushed the parchment across and he looked at it while he ate. Her notes were meticulous and slightly over-detailed in the way of someone who had learned to trust their own thinking because external sources had occasionally been unreliable. That was a guess on his part, a reading, but he was fairly confident in it. He pointed at something in the margin. "This reference, the Flamel connection to transfiguration theory. Where did you read that?" "A History of Magic, the Bathilda Bagshot one, not the textbook version. The textbook is very shallow." "Why?" "Nicholas Flamel," Harry said. "I've seen that name somewhere else. I want to find it." She looked at him with the particular intensity she brought to things that genuinely interested her. "I'll look too," she said. 2 pairs of eyes. 3, said Neville, sitting down across from them, and when they both looked at him he shrugged slightly. "I read when my gran isn't looking over my shoulder about which subjects matter. I actually like the library." "Good," said Harry. "You're in." Neville absorbed this with the expression of someone who had been accidentally included in something and hadn't been told no, and was proceeding carefully in case anyone noticed their mistake. Harry looked at him directly and nodded once, which seemed to settle something in the other boy, because he straightened up and reached for the toast. McGonagall was, as it turned out, magnificent. Harry had expected a strict teacher. He had not expected someone who taught transfiguration with the precision and authority of someone who had spent decades mastering something and was genuinely impatient with the pretense that it was simple. She had no tolerance for inattention or vagueness, and she conveyed this within approximately 45 seconds of beginning class by transforming her desk into a pig and back again without breaking eye contact with the room. Transfiguration, she said, in a voice that suggested this was not the opening of a conversation but the laying of a foundation, is among the most complex and dangerous forms of magic you will encounter at this school. Anyone who is here for an easy lesson may leave now. No one left. Matches, she said, distributing small boxes. By the end of the lesson, I expect each of you to have turned your match into a needle. Not a match shaped like a needle. A needle. Harry looked at his match. He held it between two fingers and thought about the rings, specifically about Voss, the Lord of Stone, whose ring was the dark grey band on his right forefinger, the one that resonated most strongly with things being exactly what they were and what they were made of. Not transformation, exactly, but an understanding of the nature of matter. What something was at its core. He thought about the difference between a match and a needle. Wood versus metal, but the same approximate dimensions, the same long narrow form. He thought about the flame end of the match, which was already partially mineral. He thought, become what you almost are. The match became a needle. Not gradually, not with visible stages, it simply was one and then the other, a shift as clean and complete as a word being pronounced correctly after being mispronounced for years. McGonagall was 6 desks away, correcting Seamus, when the needle hit the wooden desk with a small clear chime. She turned, looked at it, looked at Harry, and crossed the room in the way she moved, quickly, precisely, without wasted motion. She picked up the needle and examined it with the thoroughness of someone who did not accept partial credit. She set it back down. Potter, she said. Professor. Have you performed transfiguration before? No, he said, which was entirely true. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone adding a data point to a calculation. Stay after class, she said. Then, loudly, to the room, this is what a successful transformation looks like. Note particularly the uniformity of the surface, there is no wood remaining, no gradation. The object is entirely itself. She moved back to Seamus, who had created something that was disturbingly approximately both a match and a needle and fully neither. Hermione, 1 seat over, was staring at Harry's needle. She looked at her own match with an expression of renewed determination and bent over it with total concentration. Her match became a needle 5 minutes later. Harry glanced over at it and then at her, and she was trying very hard not to look smug and mostly succeeding. Nice, he said quietly. Stop distracting me, she said, but she was smiling. History of magic was exactly as described. Professor Binns floated through the blackboard to begin the lesson, which was the most dynamic thing he did for the next hour. His voice had the specific quality of water over stones, rhythmically consistent, impossible to follow, theoretically informative. Harry wrote careful notes because there was information in there and information mattered, but he wrote them with the portion of his mind that could function on autopilot and spent the rest of the lesson reading Hogwarts, a history under the desk. He found a reference to the First Lords on page 47. It was 4 lines long and described them as, a group of early magical practitioners whose influence on foundational magical theory remains a matter of academic debate. He stared at that sentence for a long time. The complete inadequacy of it, the way it managed to say almost nothing while technically conveying some information, struck him as either deliberate or evidence of a genuinely shallow source. He wrote the page number down, folded the note, and passed it to Hermione, who was writing her own history notes in her 3-color system and had somehow managed to extract genuinely interesting observations from Binns's monotone. She unfolded it, read it, wrote I know, I flagged it, checked the bibliography and passed it back. He checked the bibliography. The source for those 4 lines was a text called The Earliest Magics, a survey by A. P. Aldmere, published in 1743. He added it to his list and closed the book as Binns floated to a stop and the bell rang. Charms, after lunch, was smaller and warmer. Flitwick, tiny and enthusiastic, balanced on a pile of books with the comfort of long practice and began immediately with the foundational theory of incantation, the relationship between the spoken word and magical intention, how the two work together to produce effect. He was an excellent teacher. He moved through the theory quickly and clearly, building a structure the students could follow, and then transitioned to practical with brisk efficiency. The lesson's charm was Wingardium Leviosa. A feather. Standard first exercise. Harry let 3 other students go first: Ron, who got it on his 4th try with Hermione's correction of his wrist movement; Hermione, who got it immediately with a precision that made Flitwick bounce slightly on his books; Neville, who got it on his 7th try and looked genuinely startled, like he'd been expecting failure and hadn't planned for the alternative. When his turn came, Harry said the incantation once, made the movement, and the feather went straight up to the ceiling. Flitwick looked up at it. "Potter, perhaps a touch less enthusiasm," he said, and there was something amused and complicated in the tiny professor's expression as he watched the feather press gently against the stone ceiling. "Bring it back down, please." Harry brought it down. "Your magical output is considerably stronger than standard for a first year," Flitwick said quietly, while the class moved on. "Have you had prior instruction?" "No, sir." "Those rings," Flitwick said, and then stopped. Harry looked at him. "You know what they are?" Flitwick was, Harry realized, looking at the rings with an expression of intense scholarly recognition. The tiny professor's eyes had gone sharp and still, the way eyes go when a mind is working very fast. "I have a theory," Flitwick said, very quietly, "that I very much hope is wrong, because if it's right, you are going to have a significantly more complicated year than I would wish for any first-year student." He paused. "Come to my office at 5. Bring them." "All right," said Harry. He went. Flitwick's office was small and cluttered in a good way, books stacked with the logic of frequent use rather than display, objects on every surface that were clearly mid-experiment, a small fire that burned a color between orange and gold. The tiny professor was already there when Harry arrived, had clearly reorganized his thoughts, and had 3 books open on his desk. "Sit down," Flitwick said. "And, may I look at them?" "Just look, I won't touch without asking." Harry held out his hands. Flitwick leaned forward and looked at the 9 rings with the concentrated attention of a scholar encountering primary source material. He was quiet for almost a full minute. "9, he said finally. "All 9. Where did you find them?" Harry told him, the dream, the vault, the forest. Flitwick listened without interrupting. "In the literature," Flitwick said, sitting back, "the First Lords are a historical footnote. The official position is that they were early magical theorists whose work was largely absorbed into the foundational framework later codified by Salazar Slytherin and Rowena Ravenclaw, who were, themselves, drawing heavily from what came before. The official position," and here his voice developed a careful emphasis, "omits several important facts. Such as the fact that the 9 rings were not theoretical objects or symbolic ones. They were the First Lords themselves, their magic bound into physical form, deliberately, as a gift or a bequest or a test. The texts disagree on which." Flitwick tapped one of the open books. "The Aldmere Survey, which is the only text still in general circulation that mentions them, describes the rings as dormant. Waiting for a compatible host." He looked at Harry steadily. "All 9 rings choosing the same host is not something the texts anticipated. What do the texts say should happen with one ring? A significant enhancement of that specific magical domain, water magic, fire magic, and so on. The host would effectively be working with 1,000 years of accumulated expertise in that one area." Flitwick paused. 9 rings, in theory, should create 9 overlapping enhancements that would either complement each other profoundly or conflict catastrophically. "They haven't conflicted," Harry said. "No," said Flitwick, with the tone of a man confirming something he'd suspected. "I can see that. There is no sign of magical instability in your signature, in fact, the opposite. Your signature is unusually coherent for a first year, unusually organized. As though several systems are running in parallel without interfering with each other." He closed one of the books. "Mr. Potter, Harry. I am going to be direct with you because I think you are someone who responds well to directness. There are people in this castle who, if they knew exactly what you were carrying, would want to control it. Or take it. Or use you as a means to some other end. I won't name names because I don't traffic in accusation without evidence, but I want you to be aware that the academic question I'm raising has political dimensions. Harry thought about Dumbledore's eyes on him at dinner. I'm aware, he said. Flitwick nodded. I suspect you are. He stood up, which was a relatively modest vertical change, and extended his hand. I'm available if you have questions. I find the whole thing genuinely fascinating from a theoretical standpoint, and I believe you deserve at least one faculty member in your corner who isn't being subtle about it. Harry shook his hand. Thank you, Professor. Don't thank me. Come to Charms prepared and don't float the feathers into the ceiling again. October settled over Hogwarts with rain and falling leaves and the particular energy of a school finding its rhythm. Lessons had moved past introductory material into something with more substance and friction. Transfiguration got harder and more interesting. Charms required genuine precision. Potions was a revelation. Not in a good way, initially. Snape swept into the first potions lesson with the energy of a weather front moving across the moors, cold and fast and carrying the promise of something unpleasant. He called roll in a voice that suggested even names were potentially offensive, and when he reached Harry's name he paused. Potter, he said, in a tone that contained an entire history Harry wasn't party to. Our new celebrity. Around the room, 30-something faces arranged themselves in various configurations of reaction. Harry said nothing. Let's see if the boy who lived has read his books, Snape said, his tone surgical. Potter. What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? Draught of living death, Harry said. One of the most powerful soporifics in wizarding medicine. Asphodel is in the lily family, which is part of why the combination works. Wormwood's bitterness counteracts the sweetness of the lily family root and produces the preservative quality. Silence. Snape's expression went through something very quick and very controlled. Where did you read that? Most patenty potions for the lily family reference. The standard text for the formula. And a paper by Libacious Borage on the chemistry of counteracting botanical pairs, which I found in the library's general collection. Harry kept his tone entirely neutral. Do you want me to continue? You had 2 more questions. Snape looked at him for a long, still moment. The class was very quiet. No, Snape said flatly, and moved on. He did not single Harry out for the rest of the lesson, which might have looked like backing down but felt more, to Harry, like a recalculation. Snape was not stupid. Harry had filed that away within 30 seconds of the man speaking. He was sharp, he was hostile, and he was deeply careful. Hostility directed at someone who didn't respond the way hostility expected threw the whole system off. Harry intended to keep doing that. After class, Neville appeared beside him in the corridor looking simultaneously terrified and impressed. How did you know all of that? He whispered. Reading, Harry said. And paying attention to the fact that Snape's questions were designed to humiliate rather than inform, which meant they were drawing from the standard second-year curriculum that a well-prepared first-year might not be expected to know. So I'd specifically read ahead in those areas. Neville stared at him. You read ahead specifically in the areas he'd likely try to embarrass you in. He doesn't like me. I don't know why yet, but it's personal, which means it's predictable. Harry glanced back at the dungeon door. Predictable people are manageable people. You're a bit scary, you know that. You've mentioned it, Harry said, and Neville made a sound that was mostly laugh. The letters from Dumbledore's owl arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into term. An invitation. Tea, on Thursday, at 4 o'clock. Signed Albus Dumbledore, with his full academic titles extending for approximately 2 lines below, which Harry read with the attention of someone noting that a person who felt secure in their authority didn't typically need to list it. He went, because there was no value in avoidance, and because he had questions of his own. Dumbledore's office was circular, high-ceilinged, full of silver instruments that whirred and clicked on various surfaces, and portraits of past headmasters dozing in their frames with the practiced air of eavesdroppers pretending to be asleep. The sorting hat sat on a shelf behind the desk. Behind Dumbledore himself, the great phoenix fox sat on his perch and looked at Harry with bright dark eyes and then made a low, complex sound, not his full song, something quieter, and the rings responded to it, all 9 of them, a warm resonance that surprised Harry in its clarity. "He likes you," Dumbledore said, and his tone was the same warm, twinkling register Harry had observed across the great hall. "That is not nothing, with Fawkes. Please, sit." Harry sat. There was tea. Harry poured for both of them, because his aunt had, at least, considered serving tea a necessary skill, and Dumbledore looked faintly surprised by this. "I wanted to welcome you," Dumbledore began. "And see the rings," Harry said. A pause. The twinkle remained, but something behind it sharpened infinitesimally. "Perceptive of you. You were looking at them at dinner. You've been looking since." Harry set his cup down. "Professor, I'd rather we were honest with each other. I think we'll both find it more efficient." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at Harry with the full weight of his actual intelligence rather than its friendly performance, and Harry thought, "There he is." "Very well," said Dumbledore. "The rings. May I ask where you found them?" "In a dream. They were real when I woke up." "Do you know what they are?" "The First Lord's tokens." "I'm still filling in the details." "Then let me offer you some." Dumbledore placed his hands flat on the desk. "The First Lords were the architects of the magical theory on which everything we do is based. The 9 rings were their final work, a vessel for accumulated knowledge, designed to pass forward. They were hidden after the First Lord's deaths, with considerable security attached to their hiding place, because the magic community of the era was not stable enough to handle 9 concentrated legacies appearing in the world simultaneously." He paused. "That they found you suggests you are the host the security was designed for." "What does the security check for?" Harry asked. "Compatibility. Across all 9 domains simultaneously." Dumbledore's voice was still perfectly calm, but his eyes were doing something quite different. "The statistical likelihood of a host compatible with all 9 is, in 1200 years, it has never happened before." Harry held his gaze. "And what do you want to do about that?" It was a direct question, and Dumbledore took his time with it. "I want to help you understand what you carry," he said finally. "And I would ask that you keep it quiet, for your own protection." "There are people who would, Professor," Harry said, with respect but without apology. "I appreciate the warning, and I take the concern genuinely. But I'm not going to be invisible about this. The rings are mine. What I do with them is my decision." He paused. "What I'd find more useful than advice about what to hide is information. Specifically, anything in this castle's records about the First Lords that isn't in the public texts." Dumbledore looked at him across the desk for a long, quiet moment. "You are," he said at last, "very different from what I expected." "What did you expect?" A brief pause. "A boy who'd been kept small," Dumbledore said, and the words had something honest in them, something slightly weighted. "I made certain decisions about your upbringing based on what I thought you needed. I am beginning to wonder if I accounted incorrectly." Harry heard that. He let it sit. "I'd still like the records," he said. Dumbledore opened a drawer and produced a key. "The restricted section has a subsection that isn't on any list. 3rd shelf from the west wall, behind the mythology of the founding period. The key opens the cabinet at the end." He held it out. "You'll find what you're looking for." Harry took the key. "Thank you, Harry." Dumbledore's voice had shifted, not to manipulation, Harry thought, but to something that might have been genuine. "Be careful. Not of the knowledge. Of what others will do when they see how far ahead of them you are." Harry stood to leave. "I've been navigating other people's reactions to me since I was 4 years old," he said. "I have some experience with it." He left the office and went to the library. The weeks between October and November arranged themselves into a rhythm. Mornings in class, afternoons in the library or on the grounds, or, twice a week in early morning, on the Quidditch pitch where the Gryffindor team held their practice, in which Harry had, to the entire team's bewilderment, been recruited as the youngest seeker in a century. That had gone like this: McGonagall had appeared on the grounds while Harry was demonstrating something to Neville, specifically, that the broom the caretaker had left leaning against the building could be made to do something more interesting than hover, if you asked it properly. Harry had not meant to be noticed. He'd been aloft for maybe 6 minutes, figuring out how the broom responded to intention versus instruction, when McGonagall's voice had come from below: "Potter. Down. Now." He'd come down. She'd looked at him with the expression of someone experiencing two contradictory feelings simultaneously and prioritizing one of them. "Can you catch things?" she'd asked. "Yes," he said. She'd pulled a glass marble from her pocket and thrown it sideways with a snap of her wrist. Harry caught it without looking at it, 2 feet to his right. "I'll speak to the captain," McGonagall said, and left. He had a broom the next morning. Not the school brooms, which were elderly and handled like unhappy horses, but a Nimbus 2000, and the first time he got on it properly, the rings, specifically Lyrian's ring, the wind one, did something that felt like laughing with delight, a bright quick warmth that was gone in a second, and Harry laughed too, out loud, alone on the pitch in the early morning, because he was 150 feet in the air and moving very fast, and it was, quite simply, one of the best feelings he'd ever had. He was good. He knew this in the objective way you know something when the evidence is consistent and clear. He was not showing off about it because showing off required caring whether people were impressed, and what Harry cared about was the flying itself, the problem of it, the physics, the way a small adjustment of weight could change direction at speed, the way the rings gave him a sense of the air that was more detailed than vision. He was good in the way he was good at other things, which was by understanding what he was doing and why it worked. Oliver Wood, the Gryffindor captain, watched his first proper practice with an expression that moved from skepticism to calculation to something approaching religious feeling. "You're a bit unusual," Wood said, afterward. "I've heard that," Harry said. "I'm going to build the entire strategy around you this year." "Build it around the team," Harry said. "I'll catch the snitch, but we still need to score." Wood looked at him. "You know Quidditch strategy." "I've read about it." He handed Wood back the practice gloves. "The seeker is the decisive factor but not the only factor. If we're down by more than 150 we need to decide whether I go for the snitch or we keep playing for goals." He paused. "I'm going to need the other players to be better than they currently are. What's your training schedule like?" Wood opened his mouth, closed it, and then sat down on a bench with the look of a man encountering a kindred spirit in an unlikely place. They talked Quidditch strategy for 45 minutes. The troll happened on Halloween. Harry smelled it before he heard it, a vast, rancid, eye-watering smell moving through the dungeon corridor like a physical presence. The Halloween feast had ended in a panic when Quirrell had burst into the hall with the news, and now corridors were full of students being herded by prefects toward dormitories while the professors moved in the other direction. Harry was moving in the other direction too, but not because of any heroic impulse. He'd counted the students in the Gryffindor group and noticed the absence immediately. "Hermione went to the girls' bathroom on the second floor," Neville said beside him. Harry had not told Neville to come. Neville had simply followed, with the look of someone who'd decided to stop asking permission to be brave. "I heard a Slytherin girl say something about her today, about her showing off in class, and she didn't come to dinner." "Right," Harry said. "So we need to go get her." "Yes," Harry said, and they went. The troll was in the corridor to the bathroom, which suggested it had found the bathroom first and been deterred by the door or by the smell of girls' shampoo or by some other troll-specific reason. It was approximately 12 feet tall and carrying a club with the relaxed ownership of someone's personal property, and it smelled significantly worse up close. Harry looked at it. Then he looked at the door to the bathroom, which was closed. "Hermione," he said, moderately loudly, "we're outside. Don't come out yet." A pause. "Then, from behind the door, there is a troll in this corridor," said Hermione's voice, which was higher than usual but still fundamentally organized. "I'm aware. What's your plan?" Harry looked at the troll, which had turned to look at him with the deep suspicion of something very large encountering something much smaller than expected making noise. He thought about the rings. Not systematically, there wasn't time for that, he just felt them, the way you feel familiar things in the dark, and what came to him was Theron's ring, the mind one. Not to use on the troll minds were not accessible in any meaningful way. But Lyrian's wind was useful, and Seretha's flame was useful, and Caldrus's shadow. He looked at the club. "Neville," he said, "get behind me and stay there." "Already behind you," said Neville, who was behind him. Harry took his wand out. What he did next was not any spell from the first-year curriculum. It was not, technically, a spell at all, it was a shaping, the kind of thing the rings enabled that was less about incantations and more about understanding what you wanted to happen and having the capacity to make it happen. He flicked his wand at the troll's club and the wood of it, ancient, dried out, held together by years of accumulated grime, simply separated along its grain, the way wood wants to do when you understand its structure well enough to ask it. The club dropped into approximately 11 pieces. The troll looked at its empty hand. It was clearly an event this troll had never experienced before. Then Harry moved the air, a sudden dense pressure, a column of it, directed at the troll's chest from 3 feet away, not violent enough to hurt but more than enough to knock something off balance, and the troll went over backward with a concussive crash that shook the floor, and lay there blinking. Harry walked to the bathroom door and opened it. Hermione was standing against the wall with her wand in a white-knuckled grip and her eyes rather wider than usual. She looked at Harry. She looked at the troll on the floor. She looked at the pieces of club. "You destroyed its weapon first," she said. "It was the most efficient approach." "Not Wingardium Leviosa," she noted. "I was pressed for time." She looked at him for a long moment. "What are you, exactly?" she asked, and it wasn't a challenging question, it was the real one, the genuine one, the question of someone who had been watching him for 2 months and filing data and had finally accumulated enough to need to ask it directly. "I'm working that out," Harry said honestly. She looked at the troll again. "Well," she said, in her normal voice, the organized one, the one that meant she'd processed a thing and moved it to the appropriate file, "thank you. Both of you." She looked at Neville, who looked slightly dazed and entirely determined. "You came too." "Seemed like the thing to do," Neville said. The professors arrived, as professors do, slightly after the moment of greatest necessity. McGonagall, Snape, and Quirrell all appeared in the corridor within 30 seconds of each other. McGonagall's expression moved through alarm to relief to a stern assessment of the situation, which included 3 first-year students standing over a stunned troll in a corridor they had absolutely no business being in. "Can you explain?" McGonagall said, in a tone that was doing a great deal of heavy lifting. "Hermione was in the bathroom," Harry said. "She didn't know about the troll. We came to get her." McGonagall looked at the troll. "At the pieces of club. At the students. What happened to the club?" A brief pause. "It fell apart," Harry said. "The wood was old." McGonagall gave him a look that had "I do not believe you and I appreciate the restraint in it" simultaneously. 5 points each to Gryffindor, she said, for sheer nerve. "And 5 points from each of you for being in the corridors during a lockdown." She paused. "And I am pleased that you're all in one piece. Don't let it happen again." Quirrell, Harry noticed, had been very quiet through this exchange. He was looking at the troll with an expression that was doing its best to be concerned and was instead something slightly different, slightly calculated. As if the troll's failure was a data point in a calculation he was running. Harry filed that away. On the way back to the dormitory, Hermione walked beside him and said nothing for almost the full length of the corridor, which for Hermione was unusual. Then she said, "I should mention that I've been looking for information about the First Lords. In connection with the rings." Harry looked at her. "I haven't told anyone," she said. I see what you can do, and I wanted to understand the framework. Is that all right?" "What have you found?" he said, instead of answering directly. "That they were 9. That they each had a domain. That their work predates Hogwarts by at least 1,000 years, possibly more. That the rings they left behind are described in exactly 2 academic texts, both of which are notably vague in a way that suggests deliberate redaction. And that the vault they were hidden in was believed to be under the magical ruins that Hogwarts was later built on top of." She paused. "Which means the vault is under the castle." Harry was quiet for 3 steps. "Come to the library tomorrow morning," he said. "Early. I have a key." Hermione's expression, in the torchlight of the corridor, was precisely the expression of someone who has been handed the most interesting problem they have encountered in their 11 years of existence. "How early?" she said. 6, said Harry. "I'll be there at 5:45, she said. Behind them, Neville said, "Can I come?" and Harry said yes without turning around, and that was that. The 3 of them climbed to Gryffindor Tower through the sleeping castle, and the fire was still going in the common room, and somewhere in the walls the ancient magic of Hogwarts moved and breathed and carried its long memory forward, and Harry sat in the chair nearest the fire and looked at the 9 rings in the firelight for a long time before he went to bed. There was something in the castle. Something that didn't belong. He'd been feeling it for weeks, building in his peripheral sense, not in any room, not attached to any object he could identify, but present in the way a sound is present when it's just below the threshold of hearing. He'd find it. He had time. Chapter 3, What the Rings Remember. The restricted section's hidden cabinet smelled of beeswax and old stone and something else, a dry, clean smell that Harry associated with magic that had been sitting undisturbed for a very long time, like a room no one had breathed in. Hermione ran her fingers along the spines of the books without touching them the way you run your fingers over something hot to gauge the temperature, and Neville held his candle steady with both hands and said nothing, which Harry had come to understand was Neville's way of paying very close attention. The cabinet held 11 books. Harry took them all out and stacked them on the reading table. Most were in Old English, 2 in Latin, 1 in a script he didn't immediately recognize but which the rings, specifically Theron's, the mind ring, warm on his left thumb, began quietly unpacking the way a translator works through a sentence, not word by word but in sense chunks, meaning arriving slightly ahead of reading. He set that one aside for later. "This one," Hermione said, pulling a thin volume from the stack with the cover on the nature of bound magic, a treatise. She opened it to the middle and read in silence for 30 seconds. "Harry. Listen." She read aloud, her voice low. "The First Lords did not die in the conventional sense. The work of binding their essence, their accumulated magical identity, into physical vessels was not an act of desperation but of deliberate design. The rings are not relics. They are residuals. Each ring carries what the Lord or Lady chose to preserve, not memory precisely, not personality exactly, but the shape of a mind that understood one domain of magic more completely than any single practitioner before or since." "Shape of a mind," Harry repeated. "Like a template," Neville said. "Pressed into the metal." They both looked at him. He shrugged slightly. "My gran collects old magical objects. She always says that things which are used for long enough start to hold the intention of whoever used them. Like furniture in a house." He paused. "These rings are just, a much more deliberate version of that." "That's exactly right," Harry said. Hermione was already 4 pages further in. The compatibility requirement is explained here. It wasn't just about magical power, it was about the structure of the host's mind. The First Lords built each ring to resonate with a specific cognitive architecture. The reason no single host had ever taken all 9 before is because the 9 lords each had different architectural strengths, and the probability of one mind carrying all 9 compatible structures simultaneously was. She stopped. Was what? Neville asked. The text says it was considered effectively impossible, she said, and looked at Harry. Until it wasn't. Harry was reading the Latin one. He had just enough Latin from his school education to get the bones of it, and Theron's ring was filling in the gaps, and what he was reading was making the bones of that very clear. He set the book down flat on the table. The rings were hidden deliberately, he said. Not because the world wasn't ready for them, that's the story in the public record. They were hidden because someone tried to take them and couldn't, and the security was upgraded after that. He looked at the pages. The last person who got close to the vault was described as, it uses the word avaricious. Someone who wanted the power without the compatibility. They tried to break the vault open by force and the security sent them back. He traced a line with his finger. It says the vault opened for me because the rings chose me. Not the other way around. Hermione sat with that for a moment. They came to you in a dream. A year before I would have arrived at Hogwarts, Harry said. A year before I knew any of this was real. He closed the book. They found me before I could find them. None of them said anything for a moment. Outside the library's high windows, the November sky was the color of an old bruise, the sun not yet fully up, and the castle was almost entirely quiet, just the settling sounds old stone makes, the distant call of a bird somewhere above the grounds. What does it feel like? Neville asked. He asked it directly, without apology, the way he'd learned to ask things around Harry, just straight, because straight was how he'd learned answers actually came. Having 9 of them. Harry thought about how to answer honestly. Most of the time it's quiet. Background. Like knowing a language fluently. You don't think about the grammar, it's just there when you need it. He looked at his hands. Sometimes one of them gets loud. Specific. Like when we were with the troll and I knew what to do before I'd consciously worked it out. He paused. And sometimes they show me things I didn't ask to see. What kind of things? Hermione asked. People, he said. What they're carrying. Not their thoughts, nothing that precise. More like their emotional weather. He picked up the book with the unrecognized script, turning it over in his hands. Quirrell, he said. Something is wrong with Quirrell. The name landed in the quiet of the early library and sat there. Define wrong, Hermione said, and her voice had gone careful. I don't know exactly. But something in him is, he searched for the right word. Doubled. Like 2 frequencies in the same instrument. Most people have 1. He has 2. Neville's candle flickered, though there was no wind. That's not nothing, Hermione said. No, Harry agreed. It's not. November's Quidditch season opened with Gryffindor versus Slytherin on a wet Saturday morning that turned the pitch into a study in miserable conditions. Harry dressed in his Quidditch robes without caring about the rain, which was one advantage of having spent years doing garden work in every weather the English Midlands could produce. He ate breakfast quickly and listened to Oliver Wood's pre-match tactical summary with the focused attention he brought to all things that were actually about problem-solving. The Slytherin team was older. Most of them were 3rd and 4th years, heavier than the Gryffindor side and flying school-maintained brooms that were marginally better than the old ones but not as good as his Nimbus. Their seeker was a 2nd year named Marcus Flint, who was also, Harry noted, their captain, which spoke to his priority structure. No, that was wrong, the captain was Flint's older brother, and the seeker was a boy named Terence Higgs who was narrow-eyed and fast and had clearly spent most of his life on a broom. The Slytherin team's actual strategy, Harry discerned in the first 3 minutes, was to play physically enough to intimidate and score enough goals that the snitch became irrelevant as an option. It was not an elegant strategy but it was effective against teams with less confidence than ability. Harry found the snitch 7 minutes into the match. It was hovering near the Gryffindor goalposts, which was unusual, snitches tended toward the center of the pitch early in a match. He caught it in his peripheral vision, a flash of gold against gray, and said nothing. He climbed instead, drawing Higgs up with him, letting the Slytherin seeker think this was a search pattern move. At 40 feet he banked hard left, felt Higgs overcorrect, and then dove, not toward the goalposts directly but at an angle, a long oblique line that took him across half the pitch in 3 seconds, and the snitch moved, as snitches do, away from approaching hands, but it moved toward the right and Harry had anticipated that. His hand closed around something small and frantic. The match had lasted 9 minutes and 40 seconds. The score was Gryffindor 30, Slytherin 10. The stands went considerably louder than the weather warranted. Harry descended, hand raised, Snitch beating its wings furiously between his fingers, and Oliver Wood descended beside him screaming something that was technically words but was mostly just sound. The Gryffindor team converged on Harry in a mass of red and gold and rain, and Wood was trying to hug him while also doing some kind of victory gesture, and Harry let them, smiling, because their happiness was genuine and uncomplicated, and there was something very good about uncomplicated happiness. In the stands, a section of red and gold was extremely loud. In the opposing stands, a section of green and silver was very quiet. Harry looked through the crowd and found Draco Malfoy sitting 3 rows back, his expression arranged in the careful blankness of someone managing a more complicated internal reality than the blank suggested. Their eyes met across the distance and the rain, and Harry gave him a small nod, not mocking, just acknowledgement, and Draco looked away. In the teacher's stands, Quirrell was watching Harry with an expression that Harry clocked and filed in the half-second before Hermione and Neville appeared from the crowd, and Hermione said, 9 minutes 40, in the tone of someone who has already begun a data set. 10 exactly, Harry corrected. 9:40, she insisted. I timed it. He laughed. It arrived without planning, full and real, and Neville grinned at the sound of it. The Quidditch victory lasted as a warm current beneath the next 2 weeks of lessons, not because Harry needed the validation but because it had done something for the team, had given the whole Gryffindor side a quality of self-belief they hadn't fully had before, and watching that transformation in Oliver Wood's practices was genuinely interesting. People who believed they could do things did them differently than people who hoped they might. He was thinking about this, about belief as a functional variable in magical performance, in his Tuesday potions lesson when Snape did something new. He'd been circling the room in his usual way, observing each student's work in turn with a commentary that ranged from clinical precision to barely veiled contempt, and when he reached Harry's workstation he stopped. Harry was halfway through a forgetfulness potion that was, he was fairly confident, going to be good. The color had shifted to the right shade of purple ahead of the expected time, which meant his preparation of the Lethe River water had been correct, which meant his reading of the purity variation in their supply had been accurate. Snape looked at the potion. Then at Harry. Your instructions, he said. I have them. Show me your deviation from the standard process. Around them, the class continued with the specific quality of attention that was really eavesdropping. Harry turned his parchment to show the marginal notes he'd made, the timing variation he'd used, the reason for it, the source. Snape read it. His face did something very controlled. You substituted the standard water measurement. The standard measurement assumes a pure supply. Ours has a 6% mineral variation that would have delayed the reaction. I adjusted. Harry paused. The result is 3 minutes ahead of schedule with no degradation in quality. I can walk through the chemistry if that would, I can read, Snape said flatly, and moved on. But here was the thing Harry noticed, Snape's steps slowed slightly as he moved away. Not visibly to most people. But slightly. And twice in the remainder of the lesson Harry looked up from his work and found Snape not looking at him, which was different from Snape ignoring him. When someone deliberately didn't look at something, it meant the something was on their mind. After class, Harry stayed to decant his potion. Most of the class filed out. Neville lingered, ostensibly checking his own work. Snape remained at his desk. Harry labeled his vial, packed his ingredients, and said, without turning around, Professor, if my father did something specific to make you dislike me on his behalf, I'd appreciate knowing what it was." A very long silence. "What?" said Snape. "You knew my parents." Harry turned around. "The reaction when you saw me, it wasn't just celebrity resentment. It was personal. Something specific that involved my father." He kept his voice entirely level. "I never knew him. Whatever he did to you, I didn't do it." Snape's face had gone to a quality of stillness that Harry had learned to distinguish from blankness. It wasn't the absence of expression, it was the presence of an expression being held very firmly in place. His eyes, though, had something complicated in them that the stillness of his face wasn't quite containing. "Get out of my classroom," Snape said, quietly. "All right," Harry said, and picked up his bag, and was almost at the door when Snape spoke again. "Your mother," he said, "was one of the finest natural potions talents I ever encountered." The words came out flat and careful, as though they'd been selected from a much larger set and the others had been put back. "Your eyes are hers." Harry stood at the door for a moment. He didn't turn around. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. He heard Snape's chair move as he walked away. In the corridor, Neville fell into step beside him and said nothing for 30 seconds, then said, "You just made Snape feel things." "He already felt them," Harry said. "He was just carrying them by himself." Neville made the sound that was mostly laugh again and shook his head, and they walked toward the staircase together through the dungeon corridors cold. The thing Harry had been feeling in the castle found a shape in late November. He'd been mapping it the way you map something you can feel but not see, by its effects, by what happened around it, by the patterns in what other people didn't notice. Quirrell's double frequency, which was what he'd started calling it in his head. The way it got louder in certain corridors, specifically near the third-floor corridor that was off-limits. The way it spiked, briefly and sharply, whenever someone mentioned the Philosopher's Stone. He knew about the Philosopher's Stone because Hagrid had mentioned Nicholas Flamel inadvertently in a conversation about dragons, caught himself, and changed the subject with the complete lack of subtlety of a very large, very honest person trying to be subtle. Harry had looked at Hermione after that conversation and Hermione had looked at Harry and they'd both looked at the ceiling for a moment and then gone to the library. Flamel's research wasn't secret, exactly, it was just dense enough that most people didn't wade through it. The connection between his alchemical work and the stone was documented in academic papers from the 16th century that were in the regular stacks, not even restricted, just old and in difficult Latin. Harry and Hermione had worked through them together over 3 evenings, and the picture that emerged was clear. Flamel had created the only known Philosopher's Stone, it produced the elixir of life, it had been moved to Gringotts earlier this year, and something had tried to steal it. Something had tried to steal it, failed, and it had subsequently been moved somewhere with better security. 3rd floor. Off-limits corridor. The smell of a very large dog on the few occasions Harry had passed near it. And Quirrell, double-frequencied, whose subject was defense against the dark arts and whose hands, Harry had noticed, were always gloved. Voldemort, Harry said one evening in the library, very quietly. The 3 of them were the only ones there. Not a free agent working for himself. Someone backing him. Hermione looked up from her notes. That's a significant leap. It's the only thing that explains the frequency pattern, Harry said. One person doesn't feel like 2 people. One person who is also, he searched for the right word, housing someone else does. Neville's face had gone careful. Not afraid, exactly. The quality that had been replacing fear in Neville over the past weeks was something more useful, a watchful alertness. Possessing him, he said. Or something like it. Harry looked at his hands. Isra's ring, the blood ring, the deep red band on his left ring finger, had been warmer than usual for the past week. It was the ring he associated most directly with the awareness of living things and what was happening inside them. Something is living in Quirrell that shouldn't be there. And it wants the stone. Why? Hermione asked. If it's Voldemort, he died. He lost his body. The elixir of life wouldn't help a spirit, would it? Unless he's not fully dead, Harry said. Unless what happened to him that night in Godric's Hollow was something other than death. He tried to kill me in something, redirected. Sent him back without a body. He was quiet for a moment. The thing he needs the stone for isn't life extension. It's regeneration. Getting a body back. Hermione had gone very still. If that's true, she said carefully, then Dumbledore knows. He brought the stone to Hogwarts. He brought it to a school full of children, Neville said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite anger but was the precursor to it. With Voldemort already here. Dumbledore has a reason, Harry said. He usually does. He thought about the conversation in the office, the careful way Dumbledore had moved around certain things, the key he'd given. Not an accident, that key. Not a man who didn't think ahead. I think the stone isn't just here for safekeeping. I think it's here as bait. The word sat between them. Bait for Quirrell, Hermione said slowly. Bait for Voldemort. A controlled environment. All the protections Dumbledore set up, not just to keep the stone in, but to study what comes after it. To understand what Voldemort is now. What he can do. Harry tilted his head. It's a very cold thing to do. It's also, Hermione said, in the tone of someone reluctantly conceding a point, quite clever. Yes, Harry agreed. Dumbledore is quite clever. That's precisely what makes him worth watching carefully. The dream came back in December. Not the forest this time. He was in the chamber, the vault, but it was different from the dream he remembered, lighter somehow, and the stone plinth was empty. He was standing in front of it looking at the impression in the stone where the rings had rested, 9 shallow circles in the dark rock, and behind him someone spoke. Not one voice. 9 of them, layered together the way harmonics layer beneath a note, each distinct but together forming something larger than any single one. You are beginning to understand, the 9 voices said. I'm beginning to ask the right questions, Harry said, which seemed to him like a more accurate description. Something that might have been approval moved through the layered voices. The same thing. He turned around. There was nothing there, but the feeling in the chamber was of presence, not threatening, not even particularly serious. More like the feeling in a room where people who know each other very well have been talking, and you've just walked in. The man who taught defense, he said. What is he carrying? A fragment of intent without a vessel. One of the 9 voices separated from the rest, briefly, and Harry felt it as the Isra ring, warm, specific, the smell of old blood and green things. Intent does not die when the body dies. What remains seeks to continue. It does not have will, precisely. It has direction. And the stone would give it a body. A body is a vessel. The fragment knows this. The man who carries it is aware of what he carries and has chosen to allow it, believing it will give him something he wants in return. What does Quirrell want? A pause. What desperate people always want. To matter. Harry was quiet for a moment. Is the stone safe? For now. The question is not the stone. The 9 voices together again, deeper. The question is what you intend to do. The fragment knows you exist. It has felt the rings. It is afraid of them. Voldemort is afraid of me, Harry said, trying out how that sounded. Not of you. Of what the rings are. Of what they remember. The First Lords and what became of Voldemort are not unrelated matters. Tell me, Harry said. And they did. He woke up at 3 in the morning with the dormitory dark around him and 5 years of First Lord history organized in his mind like a library that had always been there and had just been given light. He lay still and breathed through it, all of it, the whole shape of the story, the First Lords, and what happened after them, and the long chain of events that led to a specific night in Godric's Hollow and a specific scar on his forehead. He didn't sleep again. He lay there until the sky outside went gray, and then he dressed and went down to the common room and sat in front of the cold fireplace and was very still for a long time. By the time Hermione appeared at 6:15, wrapped in her dressing gown and carrying 2 cups of tea she'd somehow obtained, he had worked through most of it. She handed him a cup, sat down in the chair across from him, tucked her feet under her, and said, "You look like you didn't sleep. I got some information." "From the rings?" "From the First Lords directly. In a dream." He wrapped both hands around the mug. The original casting of Avada Kedavra, the killing curse, was First Lord magic. Specifically, it was a distortion of Izra's work. She created what became the framework for blood magic, the magic of living things, sacrifice, the connections between life and death. Voldemort found the original texts, found her work, and built the curse from a fundamental misunderstanding of what it was supposed to do. Hermione was very quiet. "It was never supposed to kill," Harry said. "It was a severing charm. It was designed to cut the connection between a hostile magical force and a living host, to save the host. Someone twisted it, centuries later, into a weapon. And when Voldemort tried to use it on me," he paused. "The rings were already in the vault under the castle. Already, somehow, connected to the bloodline that would eventually carry them. And when the curse hit a child who was already marked as the ring's host, it rebounded," Hermione said, very quietly. "Because the magic the curse was made from recognized what it was hitting. The curse tried to sever the connection between Voldemort and his living host, himself. His own body." Harry looked at the fireplace. "It destroyed his body and stripped his power and sent him back without a vessel because the blood magic it was built from identified him as the hostile force. He did it to himself." Hermione sat with that for a very long moment. The fire was dead in the grate, but the castle was beginning its morning sounds around them, distant footsteps, the clatter of something in the kitchens far below. "Harry," she said carefully. "That means the scar isn't just a scar." "No," he said. "The scar is where the severing happened. It's where his power went through the Izra framework and got redirected." He touched it, briefly. "It's also where the fragment of his intent latched on. The part of him that had direction without a body. It tried to anchor to the nearest available magical host." He lowered his hand. "That's why it hurts near Quirrell. The fragment in Quirrell recognizes the fragment in me, and he searched for the word. They repel each other. Like magnets reversed." "Can it hurt you? The fragment in your scar?" "Not while the rings are active," Harry said. "Izra's ring specifically, it's essentially doing continuously what the killing curse tried to do once. Maintaining the boundary between what belongs to me and what doesn't." Hermione put her tea down. She unfolded her feet from beneath her and sat forward with her elbows on her knees. "What do we do about Quirrell?" she asked, direct and practical. "Watch," Harry said. "Learn. Wait for him to move. He will move. Voldemort doesn't do patience, not even as a fragment. He'll push Quirrell toward the stone, and when he does we'll know exactly what the plan is. And then?" Harry looked at the cold grate. Then he picked up his wand from the armrest and looked at it, the blackthorn, the thestral hair, 11 3/4 inches of a wand that had waited on a dusty shelf for him specifically, and thought about everything the night had deposited in his mind. "Then we end it," he said simply. The fire in the grate lit. He hadn't directed it, it was just the castle responding to the early morning, the automatic magic that kept Hogwarts warm and alive. But the light it threw across the room was warm and clear, and in the rings on Harry's fingers, all 9 of them, something moved that felt like readiness. Draco Malfoy found him in the library on a Thursday afternoon in early December. Not a surprise. Harry had been expecting it since roughly the 3rd week of term, had watched the approach angle shifting week by week, less bluster, more observation. Draco had spent 3 months revising his impression of Harry Potter from the expected narrative into something that was clearly giving him cognitive difficulty. He pulled out the chair across from Harry and sat down without asking. Harry set his book down. You're not what people said you'd be, Draco said. Not as an insult. More as an observation he'd been carrying around. What did they say I'd be? Famous and frightened. Draco's jaw moved slightly. They said you'd be grateful. That you'd be easy to manage. Easy to direct toward the right people. The right people being yours, Harry said. The right people being the ones who understand how things actually work. Draco said it without heat, which made it more honest than if he'd been performing certainty. My father said the first thing you'd need was guidance and the second was protection, and that if someone got to you early with both you'd be sorted. Set. He paused. Those were his words. Harry looked at him steadily. What do you think now? Something moved across Draco's face, brief and complicated. Not the mask, underneath it. I think, he said slowly, that you're about 12 steps ahead of everyone in this school and you're just waiting for something. He paused again. I think you found something, before school. Something old. And it changed you. It didn't change me, Harry said. It found me. There's a difference. Draco looked at the rings. He'd been looking at them on and off since the train. Now he looked at them fully, openly, with the frank curiosity he usually managed in short bursts before propriety stepped in. What are they? Harry considered his answer. Old things, he said. From before the houses, before Hogwarts. From the people who built what Slytherin and Ravenclaw built from. Something shifted in Draco at the mention of Slytherin. It was a complicated shift, not pride, exactly, but the particular feeling of someone whose identity is partially constructed around something external being confronted with the fact that the external thing has a more complex history than they were taught. The First Lords, Draco said, and Harry raised an eyebrow. Draco shrugged. My father's library is extensive. I've read more than he intended. What does his library say about them? Almost nothing. Which he said was because their work was absorbed into Slytherins and that was the relevant lineage. Draco looked at the rings with a different quality of attention than before. But almost nothing means something existed to be almost nothinged. You don't redact the things that don't matter. Harry looked at him for a long moment. You're not what I expected either, he said. Draco's face did something that in someone with less training would have been surprised. What did you expect? Your father's performance, Harry said. In miniature. The silence between them had a new quality. Not friendly, exactly, too much lay between them for that, and Harry didn't pretend otherwise. But something had been said honestly and received honestly, which was the foundation of most things worth building. The Slytherin table believes Voldemort is coming back, Draco said, and his voice was carefully level. Most of them treat it like a good thing. He paused. My father treats it like a good thing. Another pause, longer. I don't know what I treat it like. You don't have to know yet, Harry said. But you should probably decide before it becomes relevant. He picked up his book. I'm not an enemy, he added, which was as far as he was prepared to go. Figure out if that's useful to you. Draco stood, pushed his chair back in, and left without another word. Harry watched him go and thought about what the rings had told him in the night, about intent and direction and the difference between what people were built to be and what they chose. He thought about Quirrell choosing to carry a fragment of Voldemort because he wanted to matter. He thought about Draco, performing a villain his family had cast him as and cracking around the edges of the performance. He thought about himself, at 10 years old, measuring his cupboard with a piece of string. He picked up his book and read until the library closed. The first Hogsmeade weekend was in December for the older students. First years stayed at the castle, which suited Harry fine. The castle was quieter without 3/4 of its population, and quiet was useful. He spent the morning in the restricted section with the book in the unrecognized script, which Theron's ring had been steadily decoding over the past 3 weeks. The text was a record, not a theory or a treatise but an actual chronicle, written in the voice of someone who'd been there. It described the First Lords in the way people describe people they knew, specific, textured, occasionally exasperated. Aaron, Lord of Tides, had been, according to the Chronicle, famously difficult to get a straight answer from. Lyrian had never stayed in one place for more than 3 days. Sereth had been quick to laugh and quicker to act, and the Chronicle's author had clearly been fond of him. Caldris, Lord of Shadow, had been quiet in a way that the Chronicle described as the quiet of deep water, not the quiet of empty space. Oren, Lord of Void, the Chronicle described last and briefly. He did not speak much about his domain, because his domain was everything that magic was not, and language is made of magic, and so the words curved away from it. He said once that the void was not darkness. He said it was the reason darkness could exist at all. Harry read that line 3 times. He looked at the 10th ring, the one on his right pinky, plain black metal, no sheen, no resonance he could specifically identify except a quality of depth that the others didn't have. Oren's ring. The one that responded least and, when it responded, made everything else go very quiet. He folded the book closed and sat in the cold restricted section for a while, thinking about the space between things. Outside, light snow was beginning to fall on the Hogwarts grounds, settling on the lake's surface and melting, the surface moving in slow circles in the wind. In the corridor above, Quirrell was walking toward the 3rd-floor staircase. Harry felt him, the double frequency, both components of it, and set his books down and went to the door of the restricted section, and stood there, and watched the professor's back until it disappeared around the corner. Quirrell moved with a purpose he was trying to conceal under a wandering quality, the specific walk of someone who had a destination they were pretending they didn't have. Harry didn't follow. Not today. But he noted the direction, the time, the quality of the Voldemort fragment's warmth in Quirrell's presence, brighter than usual. More directed. Something was beginning to move. He went back to his table and read until dinner, and that evening when Neville and Hermione arrived back from the castle's indoor common areas, flushed with cold from a snowball fight with some second-years that Hermione insisted she had not participated in but her hair told a different story, Harry looked up from his notes and said, "It's going to move before Christmas." Neville sat down. "Quirrell. He's pushing. Getting impatient." Harry looked at his notes. "Voldemort is pushing through him." Hermione shook snow out of her hair and looked at his expression, the particular one she'd learned to read, not worried, not afraid, but tracking something closely. "Are we ready?" she asked. Harry thought about the 9 rings. The First Lord history laid out in his mind. The wand on his hip, the castle's deep magic in the walls around him. Neville's quiet steady presence, Hermione's brilliant organized mind. The dream voices in the vault below them. "Nearly," he said. Outside the windows of the castle, the snow fell, and Hogwarts stood over it all, ancient and lit from within, and in the 3rd-floor corridor something cold and patient and afraid of one specific 11-year-old continued to want what it wanted. And the 11-year-old ate his dinner and made his plans and was not afraid of it at all. Chapter 4, The Mirror and the Flame. Christmas at Hogwarts was, Harry discovered, one of the better things in the world. Not because of presents or decorations, though both were generous, the Great Hall had been transformed into something that looked like the inside of a snow globe, 12 enormous trees lining the walls, enchanted snow drifting from the ceiling and vanishing before it touched the tables, and the whole place smelling of pine and warm food and candle wax in proportions that should have been excessive and were instead exactly right. It was good because of the quiet. Most students had gone home for the holidays, and what remained was a smaller, more honest version of the school's population, the ones who either preferred Hogwarts to wherever home was, or who didn't have a home worth preferring. Harry was in the second category and made no apologies for it. There were 6 Gryffindors staying. Harry, Neville, the Weasley twins, Fred and George, who treated Christmas as a professional opportunity and had been moving through the castle since the last train left with the focused energy of people with a project, and Ron Weasley, who had stayed partly because 2 of his brothers were staying and partly, Harry suspected, because he'd wanted to stay and this gave him a reason that didn't require explaining. Ron was easy company. He talked a lot, thought out loud in a way that was actually interesting if you followed it, and had an instinctive Quidditch intelligence that Harry found genuinely useful. Neville had stayed because his grandmother was visiting relatives in Edinburgh and he'd written to ask if he could remain at Hogwarts, and she'd said yes in a letter that was warm in the specific way of people who aren't naturally demonstrative but are trying. He'd shown Harry the letter without comment, and Harry had read it and handed it back and said, "She's proud of you," and Neville had nodded and said nothing but straightened up slightly. Hermione had gone home. She'd left Harry a list of books to check while she was gone and a note that said, "Don't do anything significant without me," in her most organized handwriting, underlined twice. Harry had put the list in his pocket and said nothing about the fact that he almost certainly would. Christmas morning produced an unexpected pile of gifts at the foot of Harry's bed. He hadn't expected much. Hagrid had sent something lumpy wrapped in brown paper that turned out to be a handmade wooden flute, with a note saying he'd carve it himself, which explained the slightly irregular shape and did nothing to diminish its value. There were sweets from the Weasley twins. A book on advanced wand theory from Flitwick, which was exactly the right gift in a way that suggested Flitwick had thought about it for more than 5 minutes. A card from McGonagall with "Keep Working" written inside, which was also, in its way, the right gift. And at the bottom of the pile, a package with no note. Inside, a cloak. Silver grey, light as water in his hands, and when he held it up to the morning light coming through the dormitory window it disappeared, not went transparent, not faded, but disappeared, the light bending around it as though it weren't there at all. He put his arm under it. His arm was gone. He held the cloak for a long moment, feeling nothing from the rings, no resonance, no warning. Just a very old piece of cloth in his hands that did something impossible. He folded it and put it in his trunk with the careful attention he gave valuable things, and went down to Christmas breakfast. He thought about it all morning. The absence of a note. The deliberate anonymity of it. The timing, Christmas morning, a gift, no sender. It was the kind of thing you did when you wanted someone to have something but didn't want them to know who gave it to them, which meant either a shy giver or a calculating one. Dumbledore was at the high table, eating Christmas pudding with apparent unconcerned delight and talking to a very small professor Harry didn't recognize. His blue eyes moved across the hall with the measured sweep of someone taking attendance. They found Harry. Dumbledore smiled. Harry smiled back, picked up his pumpkin juice, and made a note. He found the mirror of Eriste on the 27th of December. He hadn't been looking for it. He'd been using the cloak to explore, not for any pressing reason, but because the castle at night was a different architecture than the castle by day, quieter in some ways and fuller in others, and the cloak let him move through it at his own pace without the social friction of being recognized and spoken to. He'd found 3 rooms not on any map he'd seen, 2 staircases that didn't appear on the standard layout, and a door on the 5th floor that led, when he opened it, directly onto a wall without any room behind it, which suggested either a mapping error or something more interesting. He found the mirror at the end of a corridor on the 4th floor, in a room that looked like it had been used as a classroom and then decommissioned, desks pushed against the walls, a chalkboard with nothing on it, moonlight from a window that looked out over the grounds. The mirror was enormous, reaching from floor to ceiling, framed in ornate gold with an inscription carved along the top, Eriste stra eru oit ube kafru oit anwosi. He read the inscription backward without having to think about it. I show not your face but your heart's desire. He stood in front of it. He didn't know what he expected to see. He'd read about the mirror, it was in Dumbledore's files, referenced obliquely in 2 of the restricted texts, with enough information to understand the basic function. He knew what it was. But knowing what something does and experiencing it are categorically different, and when he looked into the glass he stopped breathing for exactly 1 second. He was surrounded by people. Not standing near them, surrounded. A man with dark, wild hair and glasses like Harry's own and an expression that was laughing even in stillness, one hand on Harry's shoulder. A woman with green eyes, her face warm and clear and looking at him with the specific expression of someone for whom the person in front of them is the most important thing in the room. An older couple he didn't recognize but felt he should, the Potters, he thought, grandparents. Other faces behind them, relatives, connections, people who were connected to him by the invisible architecture of family. And then, behind all of them, 9 figures he recognized not by sight but by resonance, tall, ancient-seeming, wearing their domains the way a river wears its banks, and each of them had their hands over their hearts in a gesture that might have been greeting or might have been farewell or might have been both. He looked at all of it for a long time. Then he stepped back. He did it deliberately, one step back from the mirror, and looked at the image from slightly further away. The desire was clear. He felt it, warm and deep and real, not manufactured, not simple. He wanted the people in the mirror. He wanted to be surrounded by the living versions of them. He held the desire clearly in his mind, acknowledged it completely, and let it be what it was without stepping back into the glass. "I thought I might find you here," said Dumbledore's voice from the doorway. Harry turned. Dumbledore stood in the doorway in a dressing gown of impressive purple and gold, and his expression was gentle and watchful in the particular combination that characterized his more genuine moments. He came into the room and stood beside Harry, looking at the mirror with the comfortable ease of someone who had stood in front of it before and made his peace with what it showed. "You moved it here," Harry said. "Recently." "A few days ago, yes. I felt it was safer, for a while, than where it was." Harry looked at him. "You put it where a student exploring at night might find it." A pause. "An exploring student using a particular cloak, perhaps." "Which you gave me anonymously," Harry said. It wasn't a question. Dumbledore's smile was genuine, which was part of what made it complicated. "It was your father's. It should be yours." Harry absorbed that. The cloak had been his father's. He didn't show what that did to him, it was personal and complete and not Dumbledore's to witness, but he filed it, and the warmth of it, and the weight of it, and moved forward. "What do you see in it?" he asked. Dumbledore looked at the mirror. "I see myself holding a pair of thick woolen socks," he said, pleasantly. Harry looked at him. "Surprising things, mirrors," Dumbledore said mildly. "What did you see?" "People," Harry said. "My parents. The First Lords." He paused. "Not what I want to have. What I want to be surrounded by." He turned away from the mirror and faced Dumbledore directly. "I'm not going to come back to it. I understand what it does." Dumbledore looked at him with the full weight of his attention. "Most people require some persuasion on that point." "The desire is real," Harry said. "I'm not dismissing it. But standing in front of a mirror showing me what I want doesn't give me what I want. It just makes the absence more precise." He looked at the inscription. "There's no point in that." "No," Dumbledore said, quietly. "There isn't." He folded his hands in front of him. "Your self-possession is remarkable, for someone your age." "I had a good teacher," Harry said, and when Dumbledore's expression shifted toward something warm and pleased, Harry added, "The First Lords. In my dreams." A brief pause. Then Dumbledore laughed, genuinely, not the warm public figure version, a real laugh. "Of course," he said. "Of course they did." He shook his head slightly. "Harry. May I ask you something directly?" "Yes." "Are you afraid of what's coming?" Harry considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He thought about Quirrell's double frequency. About the fragment in his scar that recognized him. About Voldemort, bodiless and desperate and ancient and driven, waiting in the third-floor corridor for whatever opening Quirrell could find. "No," he said, and it was completely true. "I'm paying attention to it." "That's different." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "The difference between those two things," he said finally, "is the most important gap in human psychology. And most people never find it." He looked at Harry. "I placed you with the Dursleys because I believed you needed protection through love's magic, your mother's sacrifice, her protection, bound to blood. I still believe that was real and that it mattered." A pause. "I did not account for what it would cost you, and what you would build in its place. I should have. Harry held his gaze. There were things he could have said. He chose carefully. The cost was real, he said. The thing I built was also real. I'm not asking you to separate them. He moved toward the door. But I'd appreciate you not making decisions about what I need without asking me first. Going forward. Agreed, said Dumbledore, simply. Harry pulled the cloak around himself as he moved into the corridor, not because he needed to hide from Dumbledore but because the corridor was cold and the cloak was warm, and it had been his father's, and that meant something. He heard Dumbledore behind him. Harry. The Philosopher's Stone is safe. For now. I know, Harry said from under the cloak. But for now has an expiry, Dumbledore said. And I would rather you came to me, if things begin to move. I'll consider it, Harry said, and walked away, and was genuinely uncertain which of them was being more honest. Hermione came back from the holidays with a paper bag of books, a new highlighter set in 6 colors, and the energy of someone who had spent 2 weeks thinking and was ready to talk about it. She found Harry and Neville in the library within 40 minutes of returning and unpacked 3 books onto the table with the purposeful efficiency of a soldier laying out equipment. I went to my parents' university library, she said. The Muggle one. They have older texts than Hogwarts does on certain pre-medieval magical traditions, because Hogwarts restricted a lot of the primary sources and the Muggle academic record doesn't have the same political pressure. She opened the first book. The First Lords are in here as a folkloristic reference in a pre-Christian Celtic study. The names are corrupted, Aaron becomes Aaron, Isra becomes Esra, Orin is just Orin. But the structure matches what we found in the restricted section. 9 practitioners. 9 domains. 9 objects left behind. What does the Muggle text say they were for? Harry asked. It says the objects were left for the one who would need them most, when the need was greatest. Hermione looked up. Not the most powerful person. The one who needed them most. Harry sat back. That's a different criterion entirely, Neville said. Yes. Hermione tapped the page. Power-based selection would have produced a single dominant host centuries ago. Need-based selection explains why 1200 years passed. The rings were waiting for a specific circumstance, not a specific strength. She looked at Harry steadily. The circumstance being, a child at the intersection of 2 magical lineages who had been stripped of everything and was about to walk into the situation that the First Lord's history was always converging toward. The convergence point, Harry said. What we're building toward with Voldemort and the stone isn't random, Hermione said. It's the end of a very long story. And you are specifically the character it needed. Harry looked at the rings. Not with awe, he'd moved past awe in September. With the calm attention of someone who understood the weight they were carrying and had decided to carry it properly. When Voldemort made the killing curse from Isra's work, he said, he fractured something. In the magical architecture. Like breaking a structural element in a building. The building's still standing but it's been wrong ever since. Every Dark Lord since, every escalation in magical violence, it's the fracture propagating. Hermione's eyes were very bright. And fixing it, requires the source, Harry said. Which is the rings. Which is why Voldemort is afraid of them. He looked at the wall of books. He doesn't just want the stone. He wants to make sure I can't do what the rings are actually for. The library was quiet around them. Sunlight was coming through the windows at the low angle of January, throwing long shadows across the tables, and in the shadows the dust moved in small currents from the ventilation the castle managed on its own. What are they actually for? Neville asked. Harry looked at his hands. Finishing what Isra started. The right version of the work that became the killing curse, the actual severance. Not killing. Cutting the connection between the fracture and the magical world. He paused. Cutting Voldemort's connection to magic entirely. Not killing him, stripping him of the ability to use magic at all. Permanently. The silence had a specific quality now. Not fear. Something more like the feeling when a large thing becomes clear. That's why his fragment is afraid of you, Hermione said. Not of me, Harry said, repeating what the dream voices had told him. Of what the rings remember. January came back hard and cold, and Hogwarts settled into its post-holiday rhythm with the particular energy of a place that had caught its breath and was now moving again. Lessons accelerated. Homework accumulated. The Quidditch season resumed, and Gryffindor's second match, against Hufflepuff, was over in 12 minutes because the Hufflepuff seeker was looking in completely the wrong direction when Harry came out of a dive at 40 miles an hour and the snitch simply materialized in his hand like it had always been heading there. He landed and Oliver Wood made the sound of a man having a religious experience, and Harry patted him on the shoulder and walked off the pitch thinking about Quirrell. Quirrell had changed since Christmas. The double frequency was louder, more urgent. Harry felt it as pressure rather than background noise, the difference between a sound at low volume and the same sound turned up enough to feel in your chest. Something had shifted in the professor's resolve, the way ice shifts in late winter, the structural integrity starting to go. In defense against the dark arts, the change was visible. Quirrell had never been a good teacher, anxious, stammering, his lessons unfocused in the way of someone whose attention was split between what he was supposed to be teaching and what he was actually thinking about. But before Christmas there had been a baseline quality of performance to it. Now the performance was thinner. He'd drift mid-sentence. He'd look at the door. Once, in the middle of a lesson on counter-jinxes, he'd gone completely silent for 30 seconds while the class sat and waited and exchanged glances, and then snapped back with a brightness that was entirely unconvincing. The turban was always there. Harry looked at the turban with the Isra ring's attention, the ring that read living things, that understood the connections in biological systems, and felt, clearly, the presence of something that didn't belong. Something that had no body of its own but was making use of the warmth and the breath and the blood of someone who did. It was afraid of Harry. He felt that too. A low, cold fear from the direction of the turban whenever Harry's gaze stayed on Quirrell too long, a reflexive recoil like touching something hot. He did not confront it. Not yet. The confrontation had its own timing, and forcing timing was how you turned a planned engagement into a disaster. He watched, and filed, and waited. What he did instead was prepare. He spent evenings in the come-and-go room, which he'd found by walking past the stretch of wall on the 7th floor 3 times while thinking clearly about what he needed, and which had appeared as a door, and which had produced a space containing exactly the right floor dimensions and magical equipment for what he was working on. He worked through what the dreams had shown him, what the restricted texts had confirmed, what the rings were teaching him about the specific magic involved. The Isra ring's work, the severing. The actual form of it. Not the corrupted version that became Avada Kedavra but the original design, which was subtle in a way the killing curse emphatically was not. The killing curse was a battering ram. The original work was a blade. Precise, directed, surgical. He couldn't practice it on a living target, he wasn't going to experiment on anything alive, but he could build the framework. Understand the structure. Have it ready the way you have a plan ready, so that when the moment arrived the execution was clean. He was working through it one February evening when the door opened and Draco Malfoy walked in. They both stopped. Harry looked at Draco. Draco looked at Harry, then at the room, then at the traces of magical working that were visible if you knew what you were looking at, which Draco, to his credit, clearly did. "This room doesn't exist on the standard map," Draco said. "No," Harry agreed. "I've been looking for it since second week of term." Draco came in and the door closed behind him. "How did you find it?" "I needed it," Harry said. "What are you here for?" Draco sat down on the bench against the wall, not near Harry but not across the room either. He'd been doing this for weeks, calibrating distance, the way someone does when they're trying to determine the radius of something they don't have a precise measurement for. "My father sent a letter," he said. "After the Christmas holidays. He wanted to know what I'd found out about you." What did you tell him? Nothing useful. Draco turned his ring, a plain silver one, family crest, entirely different category of object from Harry's 9, around his finger. He doesn't understand the concept of nothing useful. He thinks everything is useful to someone who knows how to use it. What does he want to know? Whether you're manageable. Draco said the word with a flatness that contained his opinion of it. Whether you could be an ally or whether you'll be, he paused. A complication. I'm already a complication, Harry said. He knows that. Yes. A pause. He's in contact with someone. I don't know who. Letters that he burns after reading, which he doesn't usually bother with because most of what comes to the manor isn't worth hiding. He looked at Harry directly. Whatever is happening with Quirrell, whatever is going to happen with the stone, my father knows about it. Is involved in it. Harry set down the parchment he'd been working on. How much does he know about the rings? He knows you have something. He doesn't know what. Draco hesitated. He'd want them. If he knew. Many people would want them, Harry said. That's not new information. What I'm telling you, Draco said, with the precision of someone choosing words carefully, is that there's a layer of this you don't have visibility on. My father isn't working for Voldemort at the moment because Voldemort is currently not in a position to work for. But if that changes, he stopped. If Voldemort gets a body back, Harry said. Draco looked at him with the expression of someone who had expected to have to work harder to get there. Yes, he said. Harry looked at him for a long moment. Draco held his gaze without flinching, which was not what he'd been able to do in September. Why are you telling me this? The question sat between them. Draco looked at the floor, then back up. Because I have been performing a version of myself that I'm not certain I want to be, he said, and it arrived with the specific weight of a sentence that had been assembled over a long time. And you are apparently the only person in this school who doesn't expect me to keep performing it. Harry held that. He didn't make it easy, didn't rush to reassurance or alliance. He just let it sit and let Draco sit with it. Then he said, I don't need you to do anything. I don't need your loyalty and I'm not recruiting. But if you have information that's relevant to someone getting hurt, I'd rather have it than not. Draco nodded. One nod, clean. Your father's letters, Harry said. Next one that arrives. Note the date. All right. And Draco. Harry picked up his parchment again. Whatever you decide about who you want to be, that's yours. I'm not offering you a trade. I'm not the right person to either instead. Draco stood up. I know that, he said, and left. Harry stared at the door for a moment. Then he went back to his work. Valentine's Day arrived, as Valentine's Day generally does, with more drama than was warranted and less chocolate than was hoped for. Gilderoy Lockhart's portrait in the corridor had been enchanted by someone. The Weasley twins denied it with the specific grin of people who had absolutely done it, to wink at passing students, and by 10 in the morning 3 people had fallen down the 4th-floor stairs as a result. Harry ate breakfast quickly and went to find Flitwick. The tiny professor was in his office, which at this point had the comfortable quality of a frequently used space. He'd made tea for 2 before Harry knocked, which was either intuition or scheduling, and they sat with the tea and Harry put his parchment on the desk. I need a technical check, Harry said. Not a lesson. I have the structure worked out and I want someone who understands advanced magical theory to tell me if the architecture is sound. Flitwick pulled the parchment toward him and read. He read it twice. His face went through several things. This is the original Isra framework, he said. Not the corrupted version, Harry said. The actual design. Where did you? Flitwick stopped himself. The rings. Obviously. He turned the parchment. This severing mechanism. It's not, he turned it again. The precision requirement here is extraordinary. A misalignment in the target specification would sever the wrong connection, Harry said. I know. The target specification is the fragment. Not Quirrell. Flitwick was quiet for a long moment. You're planning to remove the Voldemort fragment from Quirrell, he said. Specifically. Without killing Quirrell, Harry said. Yes. The professor set the parchment down and looked at Harry with an expression that was doing multiple things at once. The fragment won't survive severance from its host. It has no independent form stable enough to persist. That's the point. And you have the capacity to execute this? Flitwick asked. Not skeptically. Like he was doing a genuine assessment. I have all 9, Harry said. The severing requires the Isra framework primarily, but stabilizing it requires the others. Orin's void to define the boundary. Theron's mind to find the precise target. Marin's light to hold the separation clean. He paused. I've been building it for 2 months. I just needed someone who understands the theory to check I haven't made an error. Flitwick looked at the parchment again. He pointed at 2 places in the structure. These 2 nodes. The junction between the void boundary and the target specification, it needs a bridge. Without a bridge the specifications collapse into each other and the whole structure destabilizes. He picked up a quill. May I? Please. Flitwick added 4 lines to the diagram. Harry looked at them, felt the ring's response, yes, that's right, that completes it, and nodded. Thank you, Harry said. Harry. Flitwick's voice was serious in a way the small professor didn't often allow it to be. If this works, and I believe it will work, Voldemort will be gone. A real gone. Not defeated in battle, not driven off. Stripped of his connection to magic and, without the stone's regeneration, ultimately mortal in the way all things without magical sustenance eventually become. He paused. This is not a school problem you're solving. This is a historical event. I know, Harry said. Are you ready for what that means? Afterward? The attention, I'm already famous for something I don't remember doing, Harry said, picking up his parchment. The attention is already a fixed variable. What I care about is the outcome. He folded the diagram and stood. I'd rather end this than be known for it. If I can manage both I will, but I'm not optimizing for being known. Flitwick made a sound that was part laugh and part something more serious. You are, he said, the most extraordinary student I have taught in 40 years of teaching. I want you to know I mean that as a fact and not as flattery. I know, Harry said, without arrogance. Thank you for the correction on the nodes. He went to lunch. The night it moved was the 15th of February. Not the confrontation, that wasn't yet. But the signal. Harry was in the common room late, Neville having gone to bed an hour ago, the fire low, and the Quirrell frequency spiked so sharply and suddenly that Harry's hand went to his wand before he'd consciously registered it. He sat for a moment with his hand on his wand in the low-fire quiet of the Gryffindor common room, reading the frequency. Quirrell was in the 3rd-floor corridor. Not passing it. In it. Harry stood up. He went up to the dormitory and shook Neville's shoulder, and Neville was awake before Harry had said a word, the dormitory sense of someone who'd learned not to sleep too heavily. Harry crouched by his bed and said very quietly, Quirrell is at the 3rd floor. Not doing anything yet. But I need you to know. Neville sat up. Should I stay? Harry said. For now. I'm just going to look. If I'm not back in an hour, get Hermione and go to McGonagall. An hour, Neville said, firmly. Like a deadline, not a suggestion. Harry went. Under the invisibility cloak, down through the sleeping castle, the torches burning low, the portrait's occupants asleep in their frames. He stopped at the 3rd-floor door, which was ajar, not enough for someone to have passed through, but enough to tell him someone had been here and left it deliberately, and listened. Silence. Then, very faint, the sound of a large dog breathing. He touched the door with 2 fingers and it swung inward on its hinges without sound. The 3-headed dog was there, enormous, all 3 heads at rest, a deep rhythmic sleep, a harp somewhere near the trap door playing music that Harry couldn't quite hear, as though the sound was just outside the register. He looked at the trap door. Undisturbed. Still locked. He looked at the harp. Magical, it was playing itself, had been enchanted to play. It hadn't been here before, he was certain. Someone had put it here recently to keep the dog asleep. Someone was testing the security. He went back to the corridor and sat against the opposite wall under the cloak and thought. Not panicking. Not performing calm, because performing calm was a resource expenditure and he didn't need it. He thought clearly, the way the rings made thinking, clean and organized, like a well-sorted library, everything accessible. Quirrell had come to the 3rd floor to check whether the harp kept the dog down. It did. He'd confirmed this. Next step was the trapdoor, and whatever lay beneath, the layers of security Dumbledore and the other professors had put in place. Each layer a different professor's work, presumably, which meant Quirrell had to work through each one sequentially. He wouldn't know what he was walking into below the trapdoor. He'd need reconnaissance. He'd be back within the week. Harry went to bed. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and felt Quirrell's frequency settle back to its background level somewhere below him in the castle, and thought about the diagram Flitwick had corrected, and the 7 rings and the void and the mind and the bridge, and the specific precise surgical quality of the severing, and held it all together in his mind with the clarity the rings gave him until it was solid and ready. He realized, not afraid of what was coming. He had tried the emotion on. Caldrus's shadow ring occasionally surfaced emotional honesty the way surfacing groundwater brought up whatever was actually underneath, and fear simply wasn't there. Something with more texture than confidence. Something that understood the weight of what was coming and had chosen to meet it rather than wait for it. The scar, for the first time in weeks, was warm rather than cold. As though whatever lived in it recognized the distinction too. Outside, the February sky was clear and full of stars, and somewhere in the foundations of the castle, in the vault that predated everything above it, 9 empty rings-shaped impressions in a stone plinth waited in the dark, and the 9 rings that had left them were on Harry's fingers, alive with something ancient and patient and finally close to their purpose. Harry closed his eyes. He slept without dreaming, which was its own kind of answer. Chapter 5. The 3rd floor isn't enough. The letter from Draco arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered not by owl but slipped under the door of the Charms classroom while Harry was inside. He found it when he left, a folded piece of parchment with no name on the outside, the handwriting inside brief and precise, last night. Date matches the other one. 2 weeks to the day. Harry read it twice, folded it into his pocket, and kept walking. 2 weeks. Quirrell had been at the 3rd floor 2 weeks before February 15th, and again on February 15th. A pattern, reconnaissance on a 14-day cycle, which suggested either genuine caution or that Voldemort's control over Quirrell was intermittent, surging and receding the way tides moved. The next surge would come around the 1st of March. He had 2 weeks. He found Hermione in the library at lunch and put the note on the table in front of her without context. She read it, looked up. 2 weeks, she said. Give or take, Harry said. That's not very much time. It's enough. He sat down across from her. I need you to do something. Tell me. Memorize the layout of the traps below the trap door. He put a second piece of parchment on the table, his own notes, compiled from every source he'd accessed, cross-referenced with knowledge of which professor's magic corresponded to which kind of security. I've mapped what I think they are. 7 layers. Devil's Snare, Flying Keys, the chess set, a troll probably, potions logic, mirror-based, and something at the end I can't identify from external observation. Hermione pulled the parchment toward her and read it with the focused intensity she brought to things that mattered. The potions logic layer, she said immediately. That's Professor Snape's work. The logic puzzle structure, I've seen it in his published papers on magical containment. He uses a specific matrix. Can you solve it on the spot? I could solve it now if you showed me the matrix, she said, with complete honesty and no arrogance about it, the way you'd say you could read a language you were fluent in. The chess set is Ron's, Neville said, appearing from between the shelves with Trevor tucked in his outer pocket and a book under his arm. Harry didn't ask how long he'd been listening because the answer was obviously all of it. He'd know how to move the pieces. He's been playing since he could sit up. Ron, Harry said. He'll come, Neville said, with the certainty of someone who knew the person in question. He'll complain first. But he'll come. All right. Harry looked at both of them. When the time comes, if it comes to going in, I go last. Not first. I need to see what Quirrell does with each layer before I follow. His choices will tell me where Voldemort's knowledge gaps are. You're going to follow Quirrell through the traps, Hermione said. I'm going to be behind him the whole way. He won't know. She looked at his face, at the quality of calm there. Harry. You know this isn't a school exercise. I know. Whatever happens at the end, I know, he said again, and the repetition had no impatience in it, just clarity. I've been preparing for it for 2 months. The diagram is finished. He looked at her steadily. What I need from you is the potions layer. What I need from Neville is whatever he knows about Devil's Snare, the weak points, the light sensitivity, the fastest resolution. What I need from Ron is the chess strategy. He paused. What I need from all 3 of you is to stop before we get to the end. Hermione's expression went through something complicated. You want us to come that far and then, the last layer is mine, Harry said. Not because I don't trust you. Because the severing requires the rings, and the rings respond to one host, and what happens in that room is specifically between me and Voldemort's fragment. He looked at them both. You getting hurt in there does nothing for anyone. I need you to trust me on this. Neville and Hermione looked at each other. The look had the quality of 2 people who had developed a shorthand over months, not identical opinions, but a shared process for resolving them. Deal, Neville said. Fine, Hermione said, which from Hermione meant she'd accepted the logic but reserved the right to revisit it. But you tell us everything beforehand. Every detail of your plan. Agreed, Harry said, and reached for her notes on the Snape matrix. He talked to Ron that evening. Ron was in the common room playing chess against himself, which was the kind of practice that only made sense to people who thought chess the way other people thought language, not as a game with rules but as a living system with its own logic. Harry sat down across from him and watched 3 moves before speaking. You know something's happening, Harry said. Ron moved a knight. Hard to miss, he said. You and Hermione and Neville have been in the library every evening for 2 months doing something that isn't homework. He moved a bishop. And you walk around the castle like you're reading the walls. What do the walls say? Ron looked up. He was straightforward in the way of people with no particular interest in being other than what they were, and his eyes were sharper than he usually advertised. Something's wrong with Quirrell, he said. Has been all year. My brothers think so too, Fred and George, not Percy. Percy thinks everyone's fine as long as they're properly documented. He paused. And there's something on the 3rd floor. Something worth protecting. The Philosopher's Stone, Harry said. Ron looked at him for a long moment. Right, he said, without particular shock. Of course it is. He moved a rook. What do you need? Harry explained. The chess layer, the size of the board, what he'd been able to determine about the piece configuration from the one time he'd glimpsed it through the trap door before it closed. Ron listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Ron, and Harry recognized it as the equivalent of Hermione's 3-color note system. The way Ron processed serious information was through total focused silence. The configuration you're describing, Ron said when Harry finished, is defensive. The white pieces will be set to prevent forward movement. Which means the solution isn't a frontal attack, it's misdirection. You sacrifice the queenside pieces to open the center and you commit the king early. He moved his own king forward on the board between them, demonstrating. Most people see a king move in the opening as a mistake. Against this configuration it's the only winning line. And you can play it in real time. With pieces that fight back. The pieces always fight back, Ron said comfortably. That's the point. He put his hand on the king. I'll take the big piece. Tell me when. How do you feel about potentially dangerous? Harry asked, because Ron deserved the honest version. My family has 6 children, Ron said. Dangerous is Tuesday. He moved another piece. Also, Hermione is going. If she's going I'm not staying behind. He said it without looking up from the board, the specific casualness of someone being honest about something they weren't going to make a production of. Harry registered this and filed it in the category of things to know about Ron Weasley. All right, he said. Also, Ron said, if Voldemort is real and in the school and you're the one dealing with it, I'm not sitting in the common room wondering how it went. He looked up now, directly. That's not about being brave. It's just, I'm not that person. Harry nodded. Saturday morning, he said. If nothing moves before then. We go over the plan fully, everyone, together. Ron looked back at the board. Fine, he said, and moved a pawn. On Friday evening, Quirrell came to the Great Hall for dinner. This was not unusual in itself. But Harry, midway through a conversation with Neville about herbology applications of magical soil theory, Neville's face went animated when he talked about plants in a way it didn't for most other things, felt the double frequency spike at the far end of the hall and looked up. Quirrell was moving between tables toward the doors, which was odd because dinner had barely begun and he hadn't eaten. His hands were in his robes, which was also odd, because Quirrell's habitual self-presentation involved a lot of visible hand-wringing. Harry tracked him to the doors without getting up. The frequency hit a peak as Quirrell passed the threshold and then dropped, not to baseline, but to the lower register Harry associated with the fragment being deliberately suppressed. Which meant Quirrell was actively trying to conceal something from someone who could feel it. He looked around the high table. Snape was watching Quirrell's departure with an expression of narrow, private calculation. Dumbledore was talking to Flitwick and either hadn't noticed or was performing not noticing. McGonagall was not at the table, which meant she was somewhere in the castle doing something, and the empty chair beside Flitwick meant Sprout was also absent. Harry put his fork down. Neville, he said quietly. I know, Neville said. He'd seen the same things, or enough of them. Tonight? Possibly. Harry looked at Hermione across the table. She had a quill in her hand and hadn't been writing for the past 30 seconds, which meant she'd been watching too. Not yet. But be ready. He finished dinner. He went to the common room. He sat in the chair by the fire with a book open in his lap that he was not reading, and he waited, and the castle moved around him in its Friday evening way, people coming in from dinner, the Weasley twins creating some small catastrophe in the corner that Percy was dealing with, someone's radio playing something at low volume, the fire crackling. The frequency stayed suppressed. Not gone, he could still find it if he reached for it, but held down, like a sound with a hand over it. At 9 o'clock it surged back without warning. Not toward the 3rd floor. Toward the dungeons. Harry put the book down. Snape's office was in the dungeons. He was up and moving before he'd made a conscious decision, which was, he'd come to understand, what Seretha's ring felt like, the battle instinct, the fast decision architecture that bypassed the part of you that second-guessed. He went up to the dormitory, got the cloak, came back down. Neville was in the common room and rose when he saw the cloak in Harry's hand. Dungeons, Harry said, very quietly. Quirrell is with Snape. Neville's jaw set. I'm coming. To the top of the dungeon stairs. No further. He met Neville's eyes. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, go to McGonagall. 15, Neville said, firmly. Harry threw the cloak over himself and went. The dungeon corridors were cold and dimly lit, the torches at longer intervals than the upper floors, the stone walls close. Harry moved through them quickly, following the frequency. Snape's office was at the far end of the lower corridor, the door slightly open, and voices coming through, low, but audible. Harry pressed himself against the wall beside the door and listened. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Snape's voice, sharp and quiet and furious in the way that was more controlled than shouting. If you go through that trap door you will regret it. I regret many things, Professor. Quirrell's voice was different down here, steadier than it was in class, the stammer gone, replaced by something smooth and confident that didn't sound entirely like Quirrell. But not this. I can make your life very difficult, Snape said. I have suspicions about you that would end your position at this school. About what you're carrying. A pause. Then Quirrell's voice again, very smooth, do you really want to threaten me, Severus? Knowing what I know. Knowing who I serve. A beat. My master has a long memory. Your master, Snape said, and the contempt in the two words was considerable, is a fragment. He is not what he was. And the plans he has made from that fragment are going to fail. A pause. There is a student in this school who will stop him. Harry, in the corridor, went very still. The Potter boy, Quirrell said, and the voice wasn't really Quirrell anymore, it had drifted further, lower, the particular resonance of something speaking through a vessel rather than from one. Yes. We know about the Potter boy. We know about what he carries. Something cold moved through the frequency. We are not afraid of a child with old trinkets. A lie. Harry felt the lie of it clearly. Isra's ring read the living thing behind the statement, and the living thing was very much afraid. Performing not afraid, which was its own kind of afraid. Then you're a fool, Snape said. And your master is a fool for not understanding what those rings are. And you understand them. A soft sound that might have been a laugh. The secret keeper. The one Dumbledore trusts to keep his eye on things. Tell me, Severus, whose side are you actually on? My own, Snape said, and the words had the weight of something he'd said before, in other contexts, many times. Get out of my office. A pause. Then footsteps, Quirrell's footsteps, moving toward the door. Harry slid further back against the wall, pressing into the shadow, the cloak doing its work. Quirrell passed 6 inches from him without looking, moving up the corridor in the direction of the staircases, the frequency bright and agitated and crackling. Harry waited until the footsteps were gone. Then he went back to the common room and told Neville to go to bed, which Neville did after extracting a full account of what had happened, and Harry sat in the chair by the fire and thought about what Snape had said. My own. Not Dumbledore's, not Voldemort's. His own. Harry filed this carefully and completely, and it changed the shape of certain things he'd been uncertain about, and he let it do that. Saturday morning arrived grey and cold and ordinary, and the 5 of them, Harry, Hermione, Neville, Ron, and after a moment's consideration Harry had added Luna Lovegood because she'd appeared at his shoulder in the library 3 days ago and said, in the dreamy precise way she had, something is going to happen soon and I think you'll want someone who can see things other people don't, and she wasn't wrong. Sat in the furthest corner of the common room before breakfast and went through it. Harry talked. They listened. He outlined every layer, every trap, every decision point. He outlined the severing, not in technical detail but in sufficient clarity that they understood what it was and what it required. He answered questions. Hermione had 7. Neville had 2. Ron had 1, which was, afterwards. What happens to Quirrell, and Harry said, that depends on how much of himself he's still got in there when it's over, and Ron nodded and that was that. Luna said, the Nargles in this castle have been particularly agitated since December. That's usually a sign that something large is building. Then, at their expressions, I mention it because it confirms your timeline, not because nargles are relevant to your specific plan. Thank you, Luna, Harry said. You're welcome. I'll stay at the end of the chess room. She tilted her head. I won't be frightened of the pieces. I've played against my father's set and it tries to bite. The session ended. Harry was not using the word team in his head because teams had coaches and formations and the implicit structure of a thing organized from outside. What these 5 people were was something that had assembled itself around honesty and common cause and the implicit understanding that none of them were here because they'd been asked or recruited or felt they owed something. They were here because they'd chosen to be. That was different. That mattered. He went to find Hagrid. Hagrid was in his hut with the windows steaming from whatever he was cooking, which turned out to be a stew of such ambitious size and uncertain ingredient list that Harry sat down carefully and accepted a bowl with the philosophical acceptance of someone who knew the risk and had decided it was worth it. Fong put his enormous head on Harry's knee and Harry scratched behind his ears and let Hagrid do the tea and the settling in that he needed to do before anything real could be said. You're going in, aren't ya? Hagrid said. Not a question. Probably within the next week, Harry said. Quirrell is going to move and I'm going to be right behind him. Hagrid sat down heavily. His face had the quality it got around things he couldn't fix, the big, genuine worry of someone who cared completely without any particular capacity for strategic thinking. Dumbledore's away, he said. Got a letter this morning, ministry summons, he left at 7. He paused. Don't reckon that's a coincidence. Harry looked at him. Quirrell arranged it. Or someone arranged it for him. Hagrid looked at his mug. Harry, these things, what you're going up against down there, I know what I'm going up against, Harry said. Hagrid, I need to ask you something directly. The dragon egg, Harry said. Last term. Someone gave it to you in the pub in Hogsmeade. A stranger in a cloak. He'd pieced this together from 3 different conversations over the past months, not because Hagrid had been dishonest but because Hagrid's honest stories contained information Hagrid didn't know was information. They asked about Fluffy. About what would calm him down. Hagrid's face went through guilt and then something more alarmed. How did ya? It's all right, Harry said. You didn't know. But the person in the cloak was Quirrell. He got the egg to get you talking. He found out about the music. Harry paused. I need you to know that you didn't do anything wrong. And I need you to know that this is nearly over. Hagrid stared at him. His eyes had gone slightly wet again, the way they did when he was trying not to show something he felt completely. You're 10 years old, he said, roughly. 11, Harry said. Last week. 11, Hagrid said, as though the correction was the most important thing he'd heard. And he stopped. You're going to be all right. Yes, Harry said, and meant it. Promise me, Hagrid said. Harry looked at him directly. He thought about promises, the weight of them, whether to make one you couldn't guarantee. He thought about the rings, the work he'd done, the clarity of the plan. He thought about what Hagrid needed from him, which wasn't certainty so much as honesty delivered with enough steadiness to be held on to. I'm going to win, Harry said. I'm not going to tell you it won't be hard because I think it will be. But I'm going to win. Hagrid held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and reached over and patted Harry's hand with one of his enormous ones, and Harry let him, and they sat with the fire crackling and Fong breathing on Harry's knee and the stew burbling on the hob, and it was, for a few minutes, completely simple and good. It moved on a Tuesday. Harry woke at 2 in the morning with all 9 rings blazing. Not warmth, blazing. The quality he associated with Saratha's flame when something required immediate response, bright and clear and completely unambiguous. He was out of bed before his eyes were fully open, dressed in 30 seconds, wand in hand, cloak over his arm. He went to Neville's bed. Now, he said. Neville was up. They went to Hermione's portrait hole. Harry had worked out the system 2 months ago, a specific knock pattern that was enough different from a normal knock that she'd recognize it in the dark, and she appeared in 2 minutes, already dressed, hair tied back with the specific efficiency of someone who'd been lying awake waiting for this exact knock. Ron was in the corridor. He'd seen Neville go past and had simply followed, with Trevor tucked in his pocket because Neville had been holding the toad and Ron had taken him wordlessly at the portrait hole. Luna was at the foot of the main staircase. Harry looked at her. She looked back with her wide, calm eyes. "I was already awake," she said. "The Nargles are very loud tonight." They moved. The castle at 2 in the morning was the quietest Harry had ever heard it, the torches burning low, the portraits deeply asleep, no sound but their footsteps and the distant settling of the stone. Harry pulled the invisibility cloak around himself and moved ahead of the group, tracking the frequency, which was ahead of them and climbing, toward the 3rd floor, through the 3rd floor, past the sleeping dog that Quirrell had put under with music from a magical recorder this time rather than a harp, the trap door still swinging on its hinges. Harry crouched at the edge and looked down. Dark. The sound of something rustling far below. He looked back at the 4 of them, faces pale and serious in the near dark, no one afraid, which was exactly right. Neville. Devil's snare. Stay with it until it's clear and then you and Ron to the chess room. Hermione takes the potions. Luna stays at the chess room end. He paused. Nobody goes past the potions room. That's the line. Nods. If you hear anything that sounds like it's going wrong, he said, don't come in. Go to McGonagall immediately. Don't wait. Define going wrong, Hermione said. You'll know, Harry said. Go. He went first, dropping through the trap door into the dark. The devil's snare recognized him immediately, the tendrils shot toward him the second he landed and the Aeron ring responded, the water intuition reading the living thing, the plant's intention, and Harry willed warmth through his hands the way Neville had described and the vines pulled back as though they'd touched something hotter than they expected. He walked through to the far door and heard the others drop behind him, heard Neville's calm voice, don't panic, relax, let it feel the warmth, and then Ron's surprised yelp and then nothing, which meant they were through. The Winged Keys room was extraordinary, hundreds of them wheeling above in a massive cavern, a broomstick propped against the wall, a locked door at the far end. Quirrell had clearly been through this, one key had a bent wing, damaged from pursuit. Harry pulled Lyrian's ring forward in his attention, the wind sense, and looked at the keys with the perception the ring offered, reading their flight patterns, the distribution, where the damaged one was in the wheeling flock. He got on the broom and was through the door in 90 seconds. He heard the others arriving as the door locked behind him. The chess room was enormous. The pieces were waiting. Harry stood at the entrance and looked at the board and saw immediately what Ron had described, the defensive configuration, white pieces locked in a formation that sealed the center, the clear line through the queen side if you committed early. He moved to the side of the room and waited. 5 minutes. Then Ron's voice on the other side of the door, and the door opened and Ron entered, surveyed the board with the look of a professional encountering something within his competence, and said, without any particular drama, I've got this. Go. The queenside sacrifice, Harry said. I know, Ron said. I saw it from here. He looked at Harry. Go on. Harry went through the door at the far end. The troll was already unconscious, Quirrell had dealt with it, efficiently, and left it crumpled against the wall. The cold chamber smelled of club and stone. Harry stepped over a fallen pillar and through the next door. Snape's potions room. A line of bottles on a table, a note, purple fire blocking the door forward, black fire blocking the return. Harry didn't need the logic puzzle, he read the bottles with Marin's ring, the truth sight, each bottle clear in its composition. The correct one was the smallest, far right. He drank it and walked through the purple flame and it parted like something that recognized what was coming through. One more door. He stood in front of it. The frequency was enormous on the other side. Both components, Quirrell and the Voldemort fragment, blazing and agitated, and underneath them, the specific cold pressure he'd felt in his scar on the worst nights. He felt the fragment in his own scar respond, the opposing magnet repulsion, and he took a breath and let the rings settle him, all 9 of them, present and warm and old, the shape of 9 minds that had understood magic more completely than anyone since, pressing against his mind like a complete chord. He opened the door. The room was tall and circular, and in the center of it stood the mirror of Erist. And in front of it stood Quirrell. "I can see it," Quirrell was saying, to himself or to something. "I can see the stone, it's there, right there, I just need to." His hands were on the mirror's frame, his body angled toward the glass, straining forward. Harry walked in. Quirrell spun. His face cycled through shock, terror, and the attempt to suppress both in a way that would have been almost sympathetic if Harry hadn't felt the Voldemort frequency crank up simultaneously to a spiking hostile brightness. "Potter," Quirrell said. "The mirror won't give you what you want," Harry said. "It only gives you the stone if you want to find it, not use it. You want to use it. So all you can see is yourself using it." Quirrell's face went rigid. "How do you? Dumbledore designed it that way." Harry looked at the mirror. "The stone's in there. I could get it out for you." He looked back at Quirrell. "But I'm not going to." The frequency peaked. When Quirrell moved, it wasn't like a person deciding to move, it was like something else using Quirrell's body as an instrument, swift and cold and completely purposeful, his wand out, a jet of fire from the tip that Harry sidestepped without the cloak, the fire scorching the wall behind him and leaving a black mark on the stone. Harry didn't raise his wand. He took his hands out of his pockets and held them at his sides, all 9 rings visible, and let the rings be fully present, not concealed, not moderated. All of them. The full weight of 1,200 years of accumulated magical purpose. Quirrell froze. The Voldemort frequency hit an absolute peak and then, contracted. Sharply, suddenly, the way a pupil contracts in bright light. Pure reflexive fear, instantaneous and uncontrolled. "Hello," Harry said quietly, to the thing behind Quirrell's eyes. "I know you can hear me." Quirrell's mouth moved and the voice that came out was not his, lower, older, the resonance of something that had been a complete person once and was now a direction without a shape. "The rings," it said, and there was something in the word that might have been awe. "I thought the stories were understated," Harry said. "You're a child," the voice said, but the fear was still there, flat and bright underneath it. "You're 11 years old." "Old enough," Harry said. "I want to ask you something before this ends." A pause. The frequency moved like something poised on an edge. Quirrell's body was rigid, controlled, barely his own. "Ask," the voice said, with the specific calculation of something that was always looking for an angle. "Did you know what would happen when you cast the curse?" Harry looked at the eyes that were not Quirrell's eyes. "Did you know it would rebound?" A long silence. "No," said the voice, and in the word, for just a second, something honest. Not remorse, nothing that simple. Something more like the specific shock of a person who had made a calculation they were certain of and been catastrophically wrong about, and spent 13 years unable to move past the fact of being wrong. "I did not know." Harry nodded. He believed it. "Right," he said. "Then this isn't revenge. I want you to know that. This is just finishing what should have been finished a long time ago." "You can't kill me," the voice said, the fear shifting back to performance. "I have no body to kill. I am beyond, I'm not killing you," Harry said, and raised his hands. The severing was nothing like the killing curse. The killing curse was a battering ram, green light, blunt force, the brutal efficiency of a distortion. The severing was a blade, exactly as Harry had always understood it. Precise, complete, specific. He let all 9 rings operate simultaneously, Isra's framework, the architecture of the severance, Orin's void, the boundary between what was Harry and what was the fragment, absolute and clear, Theron's mind, finding the precise target in the double frequency, the specific thread of Voldemort's intent attached to Quirrell's living body, Marin's light, holding the separation clean as he cut, and underneath all of them, the deep gathered warmth of the other five, Aaron's intuition and Seratha's clarity and Voss's unbreakable steadiness and Lyrian's perception and Caldrus's patience, all of it together, all nine. The light that came from his hands was not green. It was every color simultaneously, which looked like white, and the sound it made was not a crack or a blast but something more like the sound of a very large door opening somewhere. He felt the connection. He cut it. The Voldemort fragment gave one sound that was not a scream and not a word but something between them, the sound of a direction losing its purpose, and then the double frequency ended. Not faded. Ended. The silence that came after was the silence of a room where a sustained sound has just stopped, the specific quality of absence that is the negative shape of what was there. Quirrell collapsed. Harry crossed the room in 3 steps and caught him before he hit the stone floor, which was not strategic or tactical, it was simply what you did when someone fell. He lowered him down and checked his pulse, there, weak but present, and looked at his face. Quirrell looked, with the fragment gone, suddenly very young and very exhausted, the lines in his face not the lines of a villain but of a person who had carried something heavy for too long and had finally put it down. Whether he'd put it down or had it taken was a question with a complicated answer, and Harry wasn't going to resolve it tonight. He looked at the mirror of Eriste. He stood in front of it and looked at what it showed him. The image was different from the Christmas one. The family was still there, his parents, the grandparents, the First Lords at the back. But in the mirror's version of him, the 10 rings were there, 9 on his fingers and something in his expression that he recognized, after a moment, as the absence of the thing he'd been carrying all year. Not power. Not confidence. The absence of the weight of an unfinished thing. Something was tucked in his palm in the mirror's image. The stone. He looked at the mirror. He looked at his hand. In his palm was the Philosopher's Stone, small and red and warm. He looked at it for a moment. He put it in his pocket. Behind him, the door opened. Harry, Hermione's voice, tight with controlled urgency. Harry, is it? He turned around. She was in the doorway, Ron just behind her, and Neville behind him, and Luna at the back with her wand in her hand and her eyes bright. It's done, he said. Hermione looked at the mirror, at Quirrell on the floor, at Harry's face. She crossed the room in 10 steps and stood in front of him and looked at him with the complete attention she gave everything that mattered, checking, not for injury, though that was part of it, but for something more essential. Whether he was still himself. He was. She exhaled. Okay, she said. Okay, he agreed. Ron came in and looked at Quirrell. Is he alive? Harry said. He needs the hospital wing. Can you and Neville? Ron and Neville were already moving, lifting Quirrell between them with the careful efficiency of people doing a practical thing because someone needed it done. Luna was looking at the mirror. It's showing you something different, she said. Yes, Harry said. What does it show now? He looked at the mirror one more time. The image hadn't changed, his parents, the First Lords, the absence of weight in his expression. People, he said. And me with them. Luna tilted her head. That's not a desire anymore, she said. That's a direction. Harry looked at her. She was right, he thought. The image in the mirror wasn't showing him what he wanted out of impossibility. It was showing him something that was, for the first time, actually possible. Not now, not tonight in this underground room with a man unconscious and a pocketed stone and 5 children who had come here because they chose to. But moving toward possible, at whatever pace possible moved. He covered the mirror with his cloak. Let's go, he said. They went. Chapter 6, First Lord, Last Stand. Dumbledore returned at 4 in the morning. Harry knew because Flitwick had stayed up, had been sitting in his office with the door open and a pot of tea when Harry came back through the portrait hole carrying the stone in his pocket and the particular quality of stillness that follows a large thing being finished. Flitwick had taken one look at him and said, "Come in," and Harry had come in and sat down, and Flitwick had poured him tea without asking any questions, which was the right thing to do. They were on their second cups when they heard Dumbledore's footsteps in the corridor outside, the specific cadence of someone who walked with a long staff and didn't hurry even when they probably should. The footsteps stopped outside the office. "May I come in?" Dumbledore said. "It's your castle," Flitwick said, and there was something dry and pointed in it. Dumbledore came in. He looked at Harry, and whatever he'd been preparing to say on the walk from the main entrance visibly rearranged itself. He sat down in the third chair. Flitwick's office somehow had exactly the right number of chairs for whoever needed to be there, and folded his hands in his lap and looked at Harry for a long moment. "It's done," Harry said, because this was clearly what Dumbledore was trying to determine. "Voldemort," Dumbledore said. "The fragment is severed. No body, no anchor, no magic." Harry reached into his pocket and set the stone on the desk between them. It sat there, small and deeply red, warm in the candlelight. "The stone is intact. Quirrell is in the hospital wing. He was alive when we brought him up, Madame Pomfrey has him." Dumbledore looked at the stone for a long time. He looked at it the way you look at something you've been protecting for so long that seeing it unconstrained is slightly disorienting. Then he looked at Harry. "The others?" "Fine. Not hurt. They got me to the right doors and stopped when I asked them to." Harry picked up his tea. Ron Weasley played through a live chess game without losing a piece that mattered. Hermione solved the potion's logic in under 2 minutes. Neville got 3 of us through Devil's Snare calmly. Luna, he paused, was exactly what she said she'd be. Someone who could see things others didn't. "Remarkable," Dumbledore said quietly. "They are," Harry said, without qualification. Flitwick, who had been listening with the contained expression of someone who'd known the plan was happening and had chosen to trust it, looked at the stone. "What do you intend to do with it?" he asked Dumbledore. Dumbledore picked it up. He turned it in his fingers. "Return it to Nicholas," he said. Which was always the intention. He paused. "Harry. The severing, the fragment is truly gone. Not dispersed, not diminished. Gone." "Gone," Harry said. "I know the difference." Dumbledore held his gaze for a moment. Whatever he was reading there seemed to satisfy him, because he sat back slightly. "Then this is a historic night," he said, and the word historic was not dramatic, it was precise. He said it the way a scientist says a result is statistically significant, because it was, objectively, exactly that. "I'd rather it wasn't historic," Harry said. "Or, I'd rather the historic part was quiet." "It won't be," Dumbledore said, with the tone of a man being honest about something he regrets. "I want you to know that I will do everything in my capacity to ensure you're given space. But the world will want to, I know what the world will want," Harry said. "I've been the boy who lived since I was 15 months old. I have some experience with what the world wants." He stood up. "What I'd like, right now, is to sleep. And I'd like the people who went down there with me to be credited appropriately, not as accessories to whatever story ends up being told about tonight." "Of course," Dumbledore said. "Not of course," Harry said, not unkindly. "As a specific commitment. They went down there and they were extraordinary. I want that to be a fact in the record." Dumbledore looked at him, the full, undisguised look of the man who was actually there under the twinkling, sharp and deep and very old. "You have my word," he said. "On all of it." Harry nodded. "Good night, Professor." He looked at Flitwick. "Thank you for the tea." "Any time," Flitwick said, and meant it. Harry went to bed and was asleep in 4 minutes. Morning came with the specific quality of a morning after something large, the world exactly the same as it always was and fundamentally different, like furniture rearranged in a familiar room. Harry woke at 7, felt the ring's settled warmth, lay still for 30 seconds taking stock of himself, and concluded that he was fine. Not performing fine. Actually fine, which was a distinction worth maintaining carefully. Neville was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed with Trevor in his hands. He looked at Harry when Harry sat up and the look asked the question without words. Still done, Harry said. Neville let out a long breath. Right, he said. Good. He put Trevor back in his box with the careful attention he gave small living things. How's Quirrell? Don't know yet. Is it terrible that Neville stopped. I feel sorry for him, he said, as though this required confession. I know what he was doing. I know what he let in. But he looked so young, Harry said. Yes. He wanted to matter, Harry said. He made a catastrophically bad choice about how to do that. He pulled on his jumper. Feeling sorry for him isn't wrong. He'll need a lot of sorting out, one way or another. Neville thought about this. Do you think he'll remember what he did? While Voldemort was in him? Some of it. Probably not all of it. The fragment was running most of the decisions by the end. Harry laced his shoes. The thing that was using him wasn't Quirrell anymore. The question is how much Quirrell is left. They went down to breakfast together, and when they arrived in the Great Hall it was immediately clear that something had percolated through the castle overnight. The quality of the morning conversation was different, more pointed, more directional, voices dropping when teachers passed, groups forming and reforming with the specific energy of people trading a story that was growing with each retelling. Harry sat down with his breakfast and paid close attention to exactly none of it. Hermione arrived and sat beside him. She had her 3 color notes, because she had been awake early thinking and writing, because she was Hermione. I went to check on Quirrell, she said, quietly. Madame Pomfrey let me look in for a moment. He's stable. He doesn't seem to know where he is yet. She says that's normal for severe magical distress. The fragment was with him for over a year, Harry said. Possibly longer. That's a long time to have something else in your head. She also told me, Hermione paused, weighing something. His hands. Under the gloves. Harry, they're burned. Badly. The whole time the fragment was there, physical contact with, she said she'd only seen burns like that once before, and that was from dark magic backlash. She set her quill down. Whatever the fragment was doing to his body. Being a host for that. Harry was quiet for a moment. He ate a bite of toast. When he's well enough, he said, I'll talk to him. Hermione looked at him. Why? Because someone should. And because the reason he let Voldemort in was that he wanted to matter to someone, and the first person who goes to see him when he's well enough to have a conversation will matter to him more than most. Harry looked at his plate. I'm not forgiving what he did. But I'm not going to let the first thing he hears when he can listen be nothing. Ron arrived with an enormous plate and the slightly dazed expression of someone who had slept 7 hours after an adrenaline event and wasn't sure how to categorize the previous night. He sat down and poured pumpkin juice and said, the chess pieces are fine, by the way. I checked before breakfast. He paused. They put themselves back in the opening configuration overnight. The night that took a hit gave me a very dirty look. Knights always do, Harry said. Ron pointed at him. Exactly. He ate half a piece of toast in one go. What happens now? Now we finish the year, Harry said. Exams. Summer. I'll deal with the attention when it comes. The attention is already here, Hermione said, glancing at the hall, where the directional energy was increasingly oriented toward the Gryffindor table. Then I'll deal with it now, Harry said. Dumbledore addressed the school at dinner. Not with drama, he stood at the high table with the calm authority of someone who had been doing this for a very long time and had no particular anxiety about it, and said, clearly, that Hogwarts had experienced a serious security incident that had been resolved, that there was no ongoing danger, and that the students directly involved had demonstrated exceptional courage, quick thinking, And the precise qualities Hogwarts existed to cultivate. He named them, Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, Neville Longbottom, Ronald Weasley, and Luna Lovegood of Ravenclaw, and gave each house the relevant points in amounts that made the Gryffindor and Ravenclaw tables erupt and the Slytherin table go conspicuously quiet. He did not mention Voldemort. He did not mention the stone. He said the full picture would be available to parents and guardians through official ministry communication, and that if any student had questions they were welcome to speak with their head of house. Harry sat through this and watched the faces around him, genuine surprise from most, simmering calculation from a few. At the Slytherin table, Draco was looking at the high table with an expression Harry couldn't fully read from across the room, but he could feel through whatever ambient awareness the rings gave him, complicated, processing, not the expression of someone committed to a position. After dinner, in the corridor outside the Great Hall, Draco fell into step beside Harry. They walked in silence for a moment. "My father got a ministry owl this afternoon," Draco said. "Along with about 40 other people, apparently. Something about a significant dark magic incident being contained." He paused. "He'll be furious." "At me?" "At the situation," Draco said, with the precision of someone who had learned to distinguish between the two. "My father doesn't waste fury on specifics when he can direct it at systems. He'll find someone in the ministry to be angry at and someone in the wizarding press to influence and he paused again. He'll want information. About what exactly happened? About you. What will you tell him?" "A beat. That you won," Draco said. "Which is the minimum version that's defensible as fact." He looked at Harry sideways. "I won't tell him about the rings. What they are. What they can do." Another beat. "That seems like information that should stay in a small circle." "I appreciate that," Harry said. "Don't," Draco said, with the tone of someone declining credit they aren't sure they deserve. "I'm making a calculation." "I'm not," he stopped. Started again. "My father backed the wrong side. He'll spend the next year insisting it was the right side and that something went wrong in the execution, because that's what my father does when he's wrong about something large. He rewrites it." He looked at the floor. "I'm not interested in rewriting it. I want to know what actually happened." "Ask me," Harry said. Draco looked at him. "What actually happened?" "Voldemort was a fragment. He'd been living in Quirrell since before term started, possibly longer. He was using Quirrell to get at the Philosopher's Stone to regenerate his body. The stone is gone, returned to its maker. The fragment is severed." Harry stopped walking and turned to face Draco fully. It wasn't a battle in the conventional sense. It was a surgical operation. Using magic that's older than Hogwarts, older than the houses, older than the lineages most of this school considers important. He held Draco's gaze. "He's gone. Not defeated, not driven off. Gone. What that means for the people who were waiting for him to come back is their problem to solve." Draco was very still. Processing. "Your father," Harry said carefully, "is not my enemy. I want to be clear about that. What he does with the information that his position has just become significantly less politically viable is up to him. I have no particular interest in his destruction." He paused. "What I have an interest in is people not getting hurt because someone is trying to resurrect a dead political project." "He'll try," Draco said. "I know." Harry started walking again. "So will others. Voldemort's absence doesn't make his ideology absent. That's a longer problem." He glanced at Draco. "Are you going to be in this school next year?" "Yes," Draco said, slightly stiffly. "Then we'll have more conversations," Harry said. "If you want to." They reached the corridor split, Gryffindor Tower one way, the Slytherin dungeons the other. Draco stopped. He looked at the split and then at Harry, and something in his face had the quality of a decision being made, not announced, just made. "My father will want me to collect information," he said. About you. About what you can do. About vulnerabilities. I know. I'm telling you that he'll want that, Draco said, which I think means I've already answered the question of what I'll do about it. He turned toward the dungeons. Good night, Potter. Good night, Harry said, and watched him go. McGonagall called Harry to her office on Thursday morning. It was not a disciplinary meeting. He knew this before he arrived because the rings were quiet and McGonagall's face when she delivered the message had been the face of someone who had something to say and had been thinking about how to say it. He knocked, came in, sat down. She made tea, which she almost never did for students, and brought the cups to the desk with the precise movements of someone who had done a lot of things in a considered way for a long time. I want to start, she said, by telling you what I told Dumbledore this morning. Which is that the decision to bring first-year students into the protection chambers below the 3rd floor was not one I would have sanctioned, and that the appropriate course of action in the event of an emergency at Hogwarts is to inform a professor, not to go through a trapdoor guarded by a 3-headed dog in the middle of the night. Yes, Professor, Harry said. I then want to tell you, she continued, that what those 5 students accomplished in those chambers was beyond the capacity of most 7th years, and that in 35 years of teaching I have not seen anything like it. She looked at him directly. Both of those things are true simultaneously. I know, Harry said. The official record will show an emergency response incident. Dumbledore has handled the Ministry communications. Your involvement will be characterized in terms that protect you from undue attention. She paused. For what it's worth, I argued against that characterization. I believe you are more than capable of managing the attention. I was overruled, and I'll abide by it because Dumbledore has reasons I don't entirely understand but generally trust. But I wanted you to know my position. Harry looked at her. Why? Because you deserve honesty from the people who are supposed to look after you, she said, with the directness she gave everything. I have not always, this school has not always managed that, with respect to you specifically. I intend to do better. A pause. Starting with telling you that if you ever, in the remaining 6 years you'll be here, encounter something dangerous and need help, you can come to me and I will come with you. Not behind you. With you. Harry looked at her for a long moment. The rings were quiet, which was the sign that no reading was necessary. What she'd said was exactly what she meant, straightforwardly and completely. Thank you, he said. I'll take you up on that. See that you do, she said. Also, 10 points to Gryffindor for the chess room. I'm told the middle game sacrifice was impeccable. That was Ron, Harry said. I know, McGonagall said, and for just a moment she looked extremely pleased. I know it was. The week before end-of-year exams had the frantic energy of everyone realizing simultaneously that they had been at Hogwarts for 9 months and it was ending, which produced a specific density of feeling in every corridor, students rereading, revising, arguing about interpretations, borrowing each other's notes, spending long evenings in the library. Harry moved through it and found it genuinely enjoyable. The exams were a problem to solve, each one a different discipline with its own internal logic, and he approached them the way he'd approached everything else this year, by understanding the actual structure of what was being asked rather than the surface of it. Transfiguration was clean and precise, his 3 attempts at the practical exercises producing correct results without visible effort, and McGonagall noted something on her clipboard that she didn't show him. Charms was excellent. History of Magic was a long-written exercise that he completed with more cross-referencing than Binns had probably expected. Potions was, he heard Snape inhale sharply once during the practical assessment, which he chose to take as a compliment. The Herbology Practical, conducted in the greenhouses with Neville beside him at the workstation, was the one Harry felt least academic about. Neville's work was extraordinary, there was no other word, the speed and certainty with which he handled plants, the precision of his pruning and repotting, the way he seemed to feel what the plants needed. Professor Sprout watched Neville with undisguised delight and said, loudly enough for the surrounding students to hear, Mr. Longbottom, that is a first year handling a screech snap with the technique of a 6th year, and Neville went scarlet and then composed himself and said thank you in a steady voice, and Harry thought that this was, possibly, the most important thing that had happened all week. On the last evening before the final exam, Harry sat in the common room and wrote a letter. To Hagrid. 3 paragraphs. He told him it was done, that everyone was safe, that the thing he'd come to Privet Drive to deliver turned out to be exactly as good as promised. He said he'd come to visit over the summer if that was possible, which was technically uncertain given the Dursleys, but he was increasingly of the opinion that the Dursleys were a problem with solutions he hadn't fully explored yet, and this summer would be for exploring them. He folded the letter and went to the Ollery and gave it to Sable, who held out her foot with her usual formal dignity and took it with the seriousness she brought to all tasks. He stood in the Ollery in the late evening and watched her go, a white shape crossing the darkening grounds, growing smaller, becoming part of the sky, and felt the year behind him with a completeness that was rare. Not done the way a chore was done. Done the way something that was supposed to happen finally had. He looked at the rings in the fading light. 9 bands on his fingers, each one a different character, a different domain, a different weight. He'd worn them for 9 months. He'd gone from a boy in a cupboard who could make candles light by holding them carefully to someone who had ended an 11-year-old dark resurrection project in an underground chamber using magic older than the school he was standing in. He didn't feel like 2 different people. He felt like the same person, more completely himself than he'd been before. He heard footsteps on the Ollery stairs and turned. Hermione came up through the hatch, slightly breathless, her revision notes tucked under one arm. She'd clearly been in the library until closing and had diverted to find him here. She came to stand beside him at the window and looked out at the grounds. Final charms exam tomorrow, she said. We'll be fine, he said. I know. She looked at the grounds, the lake dark and still, the forbidden forest a mass of shadow against the last light. I keep thinking about next year. What comes next? She turned to look at him. Voldemort being gone doesn't mean everything is fixed. You said it yourself, the ideology doesn't leave with the person. No, Harry agreed. So there will be more, she said. More of this. Other people who want power or want the old world back or want things that require hurting people to get. She wasn't afraid of this. She was assessing it with the same clear-eyed intelligence she brought to everything. Are you ready for that? He considered the question. The real version, not the reflexive confident version. I'm ready for it to be complicated, he said. I'm ready for it to require things I don't know yet. I'm ready for there to be problems I can't solve with the rings. He paused. I'm not ready in the sense of having every answer. But I don't think ready means that. What does it mean? She asked. Not afraid, he said. And not alone. She looked at him. Then she looked back at the grounds. Not alone, she agreed, with the simplicity of someone for whom the statement was a confirmed fact rather than a comfort. They stood in the Ollery until the last light went, and then went back inside. The end-of-year feast was the last large gathering of the year, and it had the specific warmth of a place that had been through something and was still standing. The house cup had been decided, Gryffindor, by a margin that made the Slytherin table notably unenthusiastic, and the hall was loud and bright and smelled of everything good that Hogwarts kitchens could produce. Harry sat between Neville and Ron, across from Hermione, with Luna 2 tables over in the Ravenclaw section, who had caught his eye when she came in and given him a small, satisfied nod that meant something he couldn't precisely translate but understood correctly as good. He looked around the hall. At the professors, McGonagall with a quality of satisfaction she was managing to almost conceal, Flitwick bright-eyed and talking to Sprout with animated gestures, Snape in his usual position of performed indifference that was, Harry now thought, a much more complicated thing than it looked. Quirrell's chair was empty. It would be for the rest of the year, for the summer, possibly permanently. What Quirrell became next was still an open question. He looked at the high table center. Dumbledore was eating with the contented focus of someone experiencing a good meal, but when he looked up and found Harry's gaze across the hall, he became still for a moment. Something passed between them, not words, not even the legitimacy Harry was careful not to deploy on people who hadn't consented to it. Just an acknowledgement. A mutual recognition of where they'd arrived and what they knew about each other now. Dumbledore inclined his head. Harry returned it. Not trust, exactly. Not suspicion, exactly. Something that had been tested and was still being worked out, between two people who were both, in their different ways, committed to the same fundamental thing and had different ideas about how to get there. That was workable. That was, Harry thought, actually the best case version of that relationship. He looked back at his table. Ron was explaining Quidditch to Neville with diagrams made from bread rolls, which Neville was following with polite interest despite visibly not caring about Quidditch at all. Hermione was writing something in the margin of a book she'd snuck to the table, her lips moving slightly. Fred and George Weasley were running some kind of operation 3 seats down that appeared to involve small fireworks shaped like the Hogwarts crest. Percy Weasley was trying to confiscate them while also not making a scene, which was producing precisely the scene he was trying to avoid. It was, Harry thought, completely ordinary. Ordinary was, he had decided, the most underrated condition available. The train home left at 11 in the morning, and the platform was the reverse image of September, the same red engine, the same noise and steam and trunks, but moving in the other direction, back toward a world that didn't know what had happened in the castle over the last 9 months and would have to be told in manageable pieces. He stood on the platform with his trunk in Sable's cage and the cloak folded in his inside pocket and watched his friends say their goodbyes to each other. Neville's grandmother was there, a formidable woman in a green hat with a stuffed vulture on it who looked at her grandson with the careful scrutiny of someone examining a report she'd had mixed expectations for and finding it exceeded them. She shook Neville's hand, which was, Harry had gathered, her version of an embrace, and Neville stood straight when she did it. Then she looked at Harry with the full assessment of someone who took no position without data. "You're Potter," she said. "Yes," he said. "My grandson wrote about you," she said. "Specifically, he wrote that you treated him like he was capable of things." Her eyes were sharp and steady. "That is not nothing." "He is capable of things," Harry said. "He'll be the best herbology student in school within 2 years. Possibly less." Augusta Longbottom looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, sharp and complete, and turned back to Neville. Neville looked at Harry over his grandmother's shoulder with an expression that was half gratitude and half embarrassed and entirely genuine. Harry's trunk was loaded. He was standing at the carriage door when he heard his name. He turned. Draco Malfoy was standing 3 carriages back, not in his usual configuration, no Crabbe, no Goyle, just him, his trunk at his feet, waiting for whatever luggage handling system was about to deal with it. He looked like himself and also not, still the composed Malfoy presentation, the expensive robes, the careful carriage. But something inside the presentation was different from the first day on the train. Something that had, over the year, started to take up more space. He didn't say anything. He just looked at Harry with the look that was neither hostile nor friendly but had acknowledged that there was something worth acknowledging. Harry nodded. Draco turned back to his trunk. Harry got on the train. He found a compartment with Hermione and Neville and Ron, and Hermione put a book on her lap, and Ron started setting up a portable chess set on the seat between them, and Neville found Trevor under the seat where he'd somehow already migrated, and the train pulled out of the station into the grey summer morning of London, and Harry sat with his back to the window watching the platform fall away and thought about August. The Dursleys. He was going back to the Dursleys. That was the fact of it. The house, the cupboard, though he now suspected he'd assert a preference for an actual room, and he suspected the assertion would be backed by sufficient quiet authority that it would be successful, the Dursley summer. He didn't love this. He was not performing equanimity about it. But here was the thing he'd understood, somewhere in the year behind him, about containers and what they meant. The cupboard had been 32 inches wide and it had been a cage in the ways that cages are cages. It had also been the place where he'd learned to measure things and think clearly and exist precisely and survive with dignity. Those weren't the cage's gifts. Those were his. He'd built them there because they were in him to build, and the cage was just the circumstance. The rings were warm on his fingers, all 9 of them, the particular warmth of this particular morning, this particular motion through the world. He looked out the window. London was giving way to the corridor of green that meant they were heading north, and the sky was that specific flat grey that in England didn't mean rain necessarily, just the default setting of a sky that kept its options open. Hermione looked up from her book. She looked at him with the clear directness she'd had since the library that November morning, the one that didn't perform anything. "You're thinking about the Dursleys," she said. "You can tell," he said. "Your face does a specific thing," she said. "Not afraid. Just, braced." She paused. "You know you can write. All of us. All summer." "I know," he said. "And if they're," she started. "They won't be," he said, and the quiet certainty in it was new, not the quiet certainty of resignation but of someone who had decided a thing. "I'm going back there as someone different from the person who left. And I don't intend to let anyone in that house forget it." Ron looked up from his chess set. "How different?" he asked, with the practical curiosity of someone who wanted operational detail. Harry thought about it. About showing up at Privet Drive with a wand, 9 First Lord rings, a year of magic, and the particular internal quality he'd developed, the one that walked into a room and read it entirely before anyone had said a word. He thought about Uncle Vernon's face. "Considerably," he said. Ron grinned. "Good," he said, and moved a knight. They played chess until reading, then read until Birmingham, then talked until the countryside went flat and wide and the sky opened up and the train moved through it like a sentence completing itself. Neville fell asleep somewhere past Manchester with Trevor on his chest, breathing steadily. Hermione's book was closed. She was looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone whose mind was running multiple tracks simultaneously and finding the process pleasant. Ron had beaten Harry twice at chess and was working on a 3rd game against himself, murmuring commentary under his breath. Harry sat with his hands in his lap, the rings quiet, and looked at the sky going past the window. He thought about the First Lords. Not with the usual analytical frame, just with the sense of them, the way they'd settled into him over the year, 9 separate presences that were now more background than foreground, the way fluency in a language eventually stops feeling like a skill and starts feeling like an aspect of thought. Aaron with his tides. Sereth with his quick-burning brightness. Voss with his unbreakable patience. Lyrian always moving. Caldrus watching from the comfortable dark. Marin holding clean light. Theron building architecture in the spaces between thoughts. Isra with her deep blood warmth, the sense of the living world. Orin quiet in the space between everything. He thought about the vault beneath Hogwarts. The empty plinth. The 9 depressions in the stone where the rings had rested for 1,000 years, waiting for the right need, the right person, the right moment. He thought about what Hermione had said in the Ollery. Not alone. He looked at the compartment, Ron's concentrated murmuring, Hermione's sealing thoughts, Neville sleeping with his toad. He looked at the window. The sky past it. The world going by. There were things ahead that he didn't know yet. He was clear on this. Lucius Malfoy's political project, whatever form it took without its figurehead. The Ministry's management of the information that Voldemort was genuinely gone, the disbelief, the denial, the people for whom a living Dark Lord was a more politically useful story than a dead one. The long work of what came after the crisis, which was always the less dramatic and equally necessary part. His 2nd year, which would be different from the first not because he would have changed but because the world's information about him would have changed, and that produced its own kind of friction. He was not afraid of any of it. Not afraid, the version he'd worn in the early months at Hogwarts like a careful coat. The real thing. The condition Dumbledore had called the most important gap in human psychology. He'd found it in a vault in a dream, and in a cupboard with a piece of string, and in the specific face of Hagrid handing him a wonky birthday cake in a seaside shack, and in the long hours in a library with people who chose to be there. He'd found it in the act of measuring the exact size of the thing that contained him and discovering that the measurement made it smaller than it was. He turned away from the window. "Ron," he said. Ron said, not looking up from the chess. "Second year. What do you know about what's taught?" Ron looked up. He smiled, the wide easy smile of someone who'd been waiting for the year to be processed and the next one to begin. "Loads," he said. "Want to hear the worst of it first or the best?" "Both," Harry said. "In that order." And as the train moved south through the wide English afternoon, they talked, and Hermione opened her book and joined in from behind it, and Neville stirred and started listening without waking, and the rings were warm and the sky was wide and the year closed behind Harry like a door pulled gently shut, and ahead of him everything was still to come. He was 11 years old and he was not afraid. He was ready.